Give it a minute just to make sure that the chat is working and make sure. Hey guys, is the sound working? Working. Yep, it looks like we're live. Great. So Eric, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Eric. I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and now I teach at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. I got my undergrad degree in philosophy at the University of Tennessee and my PhD from the University of North Carolina. Worked for a year at Georgetown University, and now I'm at Rhodes College, and I teach, a lot of ethics classes. Most of my research is about ethics and meta-ethics, specifically the realism versus anti-realism debate, and especially about error theorists, about the error theory, whether that's true or not, and arguments for and against the error theory, and the internalism versus externalism debate in meta-ethics about reasons. So whether there are reasons for action independent of our attitudes, or whether all reasons that there are, if there are any, depend on what we care about or what we value or something like that.
Awesome. So just to get started, like the primary argument I hear against moral realism is that the only justification we seem to have is intuition, and it can be better explained by evolution as just subjective morality. And that seems to be a very strong argument to me. So what is your response to like just that in general?
Yeah, so intuition. So there's like some skepticism about intuition or something like that. They think, oh, that's not a.
To be more specific, is like intuition is a fine way to come up with a hypothesis. Like I had this intuition and I want to confirm to see if it corresponds to reality or not, but you can't use the intuition on its own as a way to justify the belief. It's more just, this is a starting point to try and justify the belief.
Yeah, I guess I would think that, it serves as a proper starting point precisely because it does offer justification. That's why you want to start there. It's the kind of thing. So if it seems to you, or you have an intellectual appearance as if something or other is true, then that prima facie justifies you in believing something. If defeaters come in showing that, there's reason to doubt your intuition or to doubt what the appearances are to you, then, you may have to give up that belief, but you're at least prima facie justified. I think that's right. So I, in general, am not super skeptical about intuitions precisely because we use them all over in philosophy. And so when we come to ethics, we also use intuition, but it's not as though we have to have, this is something that a lot of people worry about. You have to think there's some special moral faculty like in your brain and it matches up with the moral truths or something like that. I don't think of moral epistemology like that at all. I think of it, the epistemology of morality is just like the epistemology of philosophy, because ethical truths are just a kind of philosophical truth. And so we use rational reflection just like we do anywhere in philosophy. And so if you're not skeptical of it elsewhere in philosophy, you shouldn't be skeptical of it here, at least for the purposes of prima facie justification. Now, a lot of people say, okay, fair enough, maybe you're prima facie justified in believing, the deliverances of your intuition. But once you realize that we're the products of evolution, and evolution has played some role in influencing our beliefs, then you should give up your belief. And now the question is, okay, great, that's a debunking argument. There's a huge literature on that. Let's talk about how exactly that argument is supposed to work. So presumably it goes like this. You are prima facie justified in believing what you do about morality, that you should help your neighbor and not kill people and all that stuff. But evolution sort of serves as a defeater. Now it's sort of on us realists to explain, no, we can explain how our judgments about morality are justified and match up with the truths, even though we know that, it could be that something else is influencing us. And so now we got to tell the story. Realists have to tell the story. How could it be that your judgments match up with the moral truths if you think that they're, independent of your mind and sort of in a third realm, as it were? And here the realist says, oh, I can tell you that story. I'll just need to start with some starting assumptions about what's morally right and wrong. Assumptions like that it's good to survive, that, murdering your family is a bad idea, that it's wrong to do that. So let me get some starting points, and then I can tell you how evolution would push us to believe those kinds of things, and certain kinds of things it would push us to believe, but we can sort of use rational reflection to correct. So evolution is going to influence me to think that my kin are really important and everybody else is garbage. But upon rational reflection, I can think, yeah, if I'm important and the people who I think are garbage actually have no interesting properties that are different from me, I should also think that they're important. That's a way that rational reflection sort of helps us correct. Okay, but the broad sort of strategy for realists is, look, if I start with some starting points that are plausible, like it's good to survive and it's good not to murder your family, if you let me start with those, then I can explain how evolution would program us to have those sorts of beliefs, and we can use rational reflection to weed out all the bad beliefs that evolution will inevitably give us. It will incline us to believe things that are false, but we can use rational reflection to correct.
But what do you mean?
So that's the first step. Now we can tell the story about how we come to believe, all the moral truths. The next step is going to be, oh, but you don't get to assume those things because we're, presuming that, evolution is just totally, totally messed up your brain entirely.
Yeah, so the question would be is what do you mean by these starting positions that it's good to survive or whatever? How do you get to the point that that is goodness, or where is this goodness thing? It seems to be just something you're assuming, which is kind of like begging the question.
Yeah, so here's why it's not begging the question. So if what you're asking the realist is tell me the story about how our beliefs can be justified on your view, I have to start somewhere. So I have to, in order to show you that our beliefs are reliable, I have to assume that there are some truths, and I have to show you how we would come to have those truths on the evolutionary story. So I have to begin with a set of claims that we're going to provisionally treat as true, so I can explain to you how they match up with what we in fact do believe. If you don't let me start that way, then what you're going to do is, if we perform that same sort of test, we said, show me how your memory, suppose somebody said, show me that your memory is reliable. But you don't get to assume that any of your memories are reliable. You don't get to assume any of them are. Then we could never tell the story about how our memory is reliable, because if we can't assume that everything that we draw on, we will have remembered. But if we can't assume that we remember anything, then we can't even tell you how our memory is reliable. Or if you say, show me prove to me that your perception is reliable, that there are things out there and you're grasping onto them. But you can't use perception to vindicate your story, or in telling your story, you can't appeal to any claims about perception along the way. Of course, they're not going to be able to do that. You can't vindicate perception without appealing to the deliverances of your perception and assuming that at least some of them are true. But the fact that you can't complete that project doesn't show that our perception is unreliable. And similarly, the fact that you can't prove that your memory is reliable without also relying on your memory doesn't show that your memory is not reliable. And similarly, I would say, look, when it comes to our moral reliability, when I'm trying to show you that, you're going to have to let me draw on some assumptions about what the moral truths are, so that I can show you that our beliefs do in fact match up with them, and evolution would push us in that direction. And so it's not question begging. It's precisely what the task is. You asked me to show reliability, and to show reliability, I have to assume that there are some truths, and then I have to show that that evolution would push us to come to have the belief in those truths.
Well, it doesn't seem to be like answering the question that I would be asking, because I want to know, are there moral truths? Not can we be reliable about the moral truths? I want to know, are there moral truths, or are we just making it up? So like in the case of sense experience or science, we can say there are different kinds of sense experiences. Like if I have a model that can predict the future, and my sense experience can confirm that model, because our sense experience doesn't really do that very often. It's very hard to get a model that can predict the future. That's a good reason to believe that whatever that model is corresponds to reality in some way. But I don't see a corollary to morality here, because it seems like with science and confirming our sense experience, we have this independent method of like, well, it can tell us about the future, and we're really bad at that. This is really good at that. This is a good reason to trust this. But I don't see any way to differentiate imagination from reality in the same way when it comes to morality.
Yeah, on the story that you just told me, it doesn't show that your senses are reliable, that you can predict your future senses. Instead, it just shows you that you're reliable about predicting what your future sense experiences will be, but it doesn't show you that your senses are reliable at matching up to the truth independent of your mind about things that are out there. All it would show, if you could show like, oh, well, I can predict if I walk into that other room, I'm going to have sense experiences as of being in the hallway. That would just show that wouldn't show there is the hallway there. It would just show that you're pretty good at predicting what your sense experiences will be. But there's no match. Notice that unless you assume that there is a hallway out there, you have to make the substantive assumption. You're not going to be able to vindicate by means of just those sorts of predictions alone that that your judgments about sense experience are matching up with the truth about reality.
Sure. You can't like empirically prove the noumenal world independent of your sense experience, but it does seem like there is a substantive difference between the ability to predict the future about things you don't know yet. That is a very strong justification for concluding pretty much anything. So you can conclude whatever you want. If you can predict the future, you can conclude whatever you want. But I don't see anything like that in the case of morality. There doesn't seem to be any way, because what I think that does is it gives us a good reason to believe it can differentiate our imagination from reality. It's good justification for that. I'm a scientific realist. I'm fine with that. Does it prove it? Nope. I'm fine with it not proving it. But what is the methodology that we can use in the case of morality to do the same thing?
I mean, I guess I would say so if many questions here. One is, what is the methodology of moral philosophy? And there, I would just say it's the methodology of philosophy more generally. So it's considering coming at some domain, beginning with starting data that is just sort of platitudes about the domain, just like ordinary common sense truths that you take as provisionally true. And then you try to generate principles that would explain why those data are the way they are. So you generate general theories, and then you go back and forth between your general theoretical claims and how well they match up with the data that you're dealing with. And then you might have to discard some data. You might have to say, oh, I guess some of our starting intuitions were off. This is true of metaphysics. This is true of epistemology. This is true of the metaphysics of causation, the laws of nature. Like, what is a law of nature? Well, you begin with some putative laws of nature, but how do we know if they really are laws of nature? Well, you begin with them. You putatively, they sort of begin with prima facie justification, and maybe you'll have to throw them out as laws of nature later. But when you're generating a theory of what the laws of nature are, you begin with some starting points, and then you theorize, you make a general theory about what it is to be a law of nature, and hopefully you try to capture as much of the data as you can. So anyways, that's just to say, that's all you're doing in the moral domain as well. So if you are like especially skeptical of the moral metaphysics and moral epistemology, then you should be skeptical of the methodology of philosophy in general. And that it's fine, you can do that if you want. But it's not as though you've identified some special problem for morality or for moral philosophy. It's a problem that you must have with all of philosophy.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I answered the final question. You said, oh, but there just seems to be something different between like our ability to predict our future experience and, whatever moral philosophers are doing, right? So in one sense, moral philosophers can predict future experiences by means of their moral principles that they generate, by by imagining new cases and asking you to make a judgment about whether that would be morally right or morally wrong. So in that sense, they can predict that, if this general principle is true and you consider this case, you should come out with a judgment that this is right or wrong. And it can show you that, and you could have your theory confirmed or disconfirmed in that sense. So if you think that utilitarianism is true, then that means that you must think that it's okay to kill one person to save 1,000. Now consider a case in which you have to kill one person to save 1,000. Would it be permissible? I mean, most people say, yeah, it would be. Okay, that's confirmation for utilitarianism. And you could come up with all sorts of different novel suggestions or novel cases. The theory has implications, and you can see if those implications are confirmed in your judgment about those cases. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I would really just like to hear what is supposed to be different about the case you mentioned where, with sense experience, we can predict our future experiences, but in morality, maybe we can't. I tried to suggest we can in some sense, but now I want to know, maybe that's a difference. Why is that a relevant difference between these two? What's the principle that would explain why this is the senses are in better shape than our moral faculties, whatever those happen to be?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the super chat, Secular Psyche. I appreciate it. I would say the difference is that one, science can build stuff. Technology, fly planes, technology, like computers, quantum mechanics, discover things about the universe. It seems like even without there's a prima facie reason to think science is better than everything else. So that we have a good reason to conclude science is the most trustworthy thing we have, essentially, with math and logic, whatever. But it doesn't seem like morality lives up to that standard. It seems like there is a big difference between those two. And so to go off of what you presented, we can, if we agree there's a prima facie reason to believe morality, we have moral experiences, intuitions, and they could correspond to something independent of our opinions. It could be not subjective. And if it does, then our epistemology could be justified in corresponding to those things. But the question is, does it? Do we have a reason to believe that our moral intuitions correspond to anything objective, independent of our just subjective opinions? And that's the part I don't see a justification for in what you said yet. To me, it seems like it could just be just evolution. Evolution explains all of that. That seems to be the most supported thing because there's lots and lots of evidence evolution does these kinds of things. So do we have any reason to believe that there's this moral realism, that morality corresponds to anything independent of our experience beyond just the fact that we have the feelings?
So two things. The first thing is, but science builds stuff and morality doesn't. There's an explanation for that. It's because science is a descriptive discipline. It's trying to describe the way the empirical world is, and it's trying to predict certain things. What normative theories, what ethics is trying to do, they're normative theories. So they're not trying to build things. So the fact that they can't build things, or they're not trying to predict people's behavior. So when people offer utilitarianism as a moral theory, They're saying what you ought to do is maximize utility. They're not suggesting that people will maximize utility. They probably won't. The theory isn't disconfirmed by the fact that no one obeys it. It's a normative theory, so its task is to tell you the way people ought to behave, and so it's not one of its success conditions that it can build things or that it can predict things. It's just a mistake. It's sort of like if somebody created a washer machine and you looked at it and you complain that it won't fix your car. What the builder should say is, yeah, it's not supposed to do that. It was never one of the tasks of this washing machine of this washing machine to fix a car. It's not like a failure of the washing machine that it doesn't fix a car. It was no one ever wanted it to do that. So you're using, standards that you grab from some other domain, completely different, and applying them to this other domain. And that's a mistake. You're using the wrong standards. And you can see that if you just understand. It's a normative discipline. It tells you the way you ought to behave, not the way you do in fact behave. Okay, so that's the first thing about the technology. But your question is, yeah, but evolution explains everything, right? So this is what the whole, so when the debunker brings this challenge to the realist, what they're saying is, explain to me how our beliefs match up with the truths independent of our minds when evolution is playing this role. Okay?
I would say that's not how I would phrase it. So I would phrase it as saying, I don't care if our beliefs correspond or not. I want to know, is there a reason to believe those truths exist independent of minds? I don't care if our beliefs could be wrong. Let's say all our beliefs about morality are 100% wrong. Show me how it is even in principle possible for there to be such a thing.
Okay, good. So then evolution doesn't seem to be doing anything. It seems more just like the moral truths would be weird if they existed. They would be very strange. And it doesn't seem that evolution is playing a role in that. It's just like, how could there even be such things as what you ought to do independent of your desires? Is that you think that's a right characterization? I don't see what role evolution is playing.
Well, so because the evidence that the moral realist presents is that we have these moral intuitions, and the moral intuitions can all be explained by evolution. And so there's no requirement or that there actually be any independent objective truths to cause these intuitions. So the intuitions, the fact that we have them, can fully be explained by evolution, and therefore the intuitions themselves existing seem to be more supported by the evolutionary hypothesis than by the hypothesis there is actually these moral principles there. And so it seems to not be, or it seems to be like, if we were going to compare which gives more evidence towards, it would seem to give more evidence towards the evolutionary hypothesis than the moral realist hypothesis. Kind of like, if I see a gold brick, I could say, well, that could be evidence of a gold-loving leprechaun in my basement. Or it could be evidence that I bought a gold brick, or someone in my house owns a gold brick or something. And it seems like my parents owning a gold brick is a far better explanation here. And the same thing seems to apply to morality. Like, what's a better explanation of what we see in our moral intuitions? Evolution seems to be the better explanation, and going with that there is this objective moral realism thing seems to be more akin to there's a magical leprechaun in my basement.
Yeah, if the question is like, why would anybody think that there are such truths? It's because they make sense of lots of things. They make sense of our intuitions about lots of things. Now you say, oh, but that's just, that's just, evolution doing its thing. But what I was trying to point out is that whether evolution is a successful explanation for all of that is the subject of deep and intractable disagreement, and has been for a long time. There's a massive literature on whether or not it is a good explanation for our experiences. And the fact that, so this is, I think, often missed, that that this challenge has been brought up, for a very long time, and there's tons of debates, and it often depends on very sort of unstated assumptions that are lying in the background. One of which, as I mentioned earlier, was just that in order to vindicate some faculty, you have to be able to do so by appeal only to faculties that are not that faculty itself. But that's a mistake. Now, your thought is like, oh, well, evolution can explain everything. Well, here's one thing. So evolution definitely explains, like, for instance, why I am inclined to eat fats and sugars and to think that they're great, and to be inclined to eat as much of them as I can. But everybody agrees that we can sort of step back from this inclination that evolution has sort of implanted in us or whatever. We can step back from that inclination and ask whether or not it's a good idea to continue to do that. And we can all see that the answer is no. And that's just from a merely self-interested. This isn't even a moral point. Just from a self-interested point, evolution inclines us to believe certain things, which we can step back from with rational reflection and ask whether or not that's a good idea. So we can sort of overcome, by means of rational reflection, the inclinations that evolution implants in us. That's just one case. Evolution may incline me to kill lots of animals and not really care much about their suffering, because the kinds of beings that were on the African savannah couldn't be the kinds of things that are super sensitive to animals. And yet here I am, I'm sort of worried about the kind of suffering that animals have. So what that suggests is I can step back from the things that evolution has inclined me to believe and ask whether or not it's a good idea. So if you think that it can do that, that we're not just slaves to evolution when it comes to forming our beliefs, and in the personal, in the prudential value, that is in the self-interested case, and evolution may incline you to believe certain things, and yet you can step back from it and evaluate whether or not those are good reasons to believe. It looks like, why would morality be this one place where evolution just programs and we can't get past it by means of rational reflection? Rational reflection is just hopeless to correct for any sort of inclinations that it gives you to believe. We can correct for evolution with every other domain of our life. Why would morality be any different?
I don't think it is. Like, for example, many people see it as being homosexual as immoral because of religious beliefs, and then with rational reflection, like, nope, that's wrong. And people overcome that all the time. So it seems like our moral inclinations are in many cases determined by like social conditions, kind of like food, and we see things as immoral because our parents tell us so, and we get this guilt feeling that they don't touch the fine silverware or whatever. And then with rational reflection, like, oh, that doesn't matter, like that was just some stupid thing my parents said. So it seems like our moral intuitions can be overcome with rational thought, just like hunger.
Yeah, that's my point. The point is, like, we're not slaves to evolution and what it inclines us to believe. So the question was, doesn't evolution explain why we have the moral beliefs that we have? Answer, no. Rational reflection explains a lot of it. Evolution inclines us to believe some things, but then we think about the reasons that we believe what we believe, and we appeal to the reasons to explain why we believe what we believe.
How is that different from evolution? Because doesn't evolution give us that too?
So in one sense, I mean, evolution gives us our brains, which we then use to consult reasons for action, reasons to do this and reasons to do that. So in that sense, evolution, yeah. But then, I mean, evolution gives us our brains, which is how we come to know about, deep physics or really complicated math. So in that sense, yeah, I guess morality is on the same level as physics and math. We take this thing given to us by evolution, and then we use it to do things that evolution never wanted us to do, like come to know the moral truths, come to know the mathematical truths, come to know the physical truths. So in that sense, we're using a thing that evolution gave us. And if you want to say, well, evolution explains that, then I'm happy to say, fine. But then morality is in no worse position than physics or math. We use this thing that evolution gave us for purposes that evolution never intended, which is to discover these truths independent of our minds.
Yeah, so that's where I see a huge discontinuity, because I see that like a false analogy, because it doesn't seem like morality is anywhere near as justified as physics or math. And I don't understand how you bridge that gap. Even if we grant that maybe like the starting epistemic assumptions, which for all ideologies are pretty much the same, have to be the same in the case of physics and math, does not mean the entire ideologies are the same, because there seems to be a big substantive difference between the field of physics and the field of morality. Even if the first starting assumption is the same, that does not mean that they are equivalent fields. So the fact that with physics we can build computers and planes and do all kinds of things seems to significantly outweigh the reasonableness to believe it's true to morality. Even if the starting assumption may be the same, the rest isn't. So I don't see any further justification to believe this moral realism that you're promoting, other than the fact, well, the starting assumption in both fields are the same, therefore the whole fields are the same, like composition division kind of fallacy.
Well, so you keep saying like morality just isn't as justified as physics. And I can point to that because physics builds stuff and morality doesn't. But remember, I said,
oh, yeah,
but that's not a shortcoming of morality because we're doing normative theory, not descriptive theory. So right. I'll just say, oh, you haven't shown that morality is in bad shape right now.
Right. So then I would ask,
why morality is in bad shape?
Yeah. So I'd ask, for me, it seems, what?
Morality doesn't build stuff. That's true. But they weren't trying to. More philosophers aren't trying to build stuff.
Right. So I'd say that I don't think it matters what they're trying to do. What matters is do we have what are the reasonable ways do we have to justify things? If you can build stuff, that's a reasonable way to think it corresponds to reality. Even if your goal isn't to build stuff, like maybe you're like an astrologer or whatever. My goal isn't to predict the future. I don't care. But that means you haven't provided a way to justify your belief. You're just saying you don't do the things that we know justify beliefs. So you would still need to provide some independent way that's equivalent to building stuff to justify the belief. Because to me, it seems like the science, even though, again, the starting assumption of both of science and morality might be the same. The fact that we can build stuff is an additional thing that adds weight to the scientific belief system, but it doesn't seem like you have any equivalent way to add justification to the moral belief system. So even if you think yours doesn't build stuff, that's fine. You need to provide some other way to differentiate imagination from reality, some other methodology to make these reasonable to believe.
Yeah, what do you do about what do you do in philosophy more generally? It looks like all of these objections that you're raising, like it doesn't build stuff, or it doesn't you need some other way to confirm this or that. It seems like this applies to all philosophical truths.
Sure.
So are you skeptical about all of philosophy? It's fine if you are. I'm just wondering, like, how far do you want to extend it? Because it doesn't look like a special problem for morality here. All the things you're saying, like morality doesn't do, or the moral realism doesn't do. It's true of all metaphysics about personal identity, A theory versus B theory, the nature of causation, the nature of the laws of nature. None of this stuff has like the kinds of things that you're asking for either. Do you want to be skeptical about those? It's fine if you do. I'm just wondering how deep we need to go before we come back to morality.
Sure. So I'd say that all philosophy is imaginary. It's conceptual stuff you make up in your head, and in order to make it justified, you need some additional metric to differentiate imagination from reality. And science, I think, provides that with novel testable predictions. Predicting things we don't know about the universe yet is a really good way. I think philosophy that is self-descriptive is fine, like 1 + 1 = 2, A = A. Those are languages. You're making up a thing about the language, so that's fine. But when you try to say it corresponds to something independent of the language, something about the world independent of our imagination, that's where you need that extra step. So a lot of philosophy, like math, fine, I don't care, it's just language. But when you say, I want to believe there is some truth about the world independent of our imagination, you're going to need some additional thing there.
Yeah, so we could get to arguments for realism here in just a second, but the first thing is that take anti-realism about morality, or take your view about metaethics. So one view you could have is error theory. That's the view that towards morality that atheists take towards God. There's this thing that people talk about, but the thing they're talking about just isn't there. Reality just doesn't have the thing that they want to be there. You could have that view about morality as well. Now, if you thought, well, all philosophy is sort of imaginary, because there's no method to determine imaginary from non-imaginary or something like that, then I guess it also applies to anti-realism and error theory in metaethics as well. So there's a sense in which, like, if what you're requiring of realism also can't be met by the error theory or anti-realism, then that's bad news for your view. If you think that discredits realism, it also discredits your own view about metaethics, because it's the kind of thing that doesn't build anything. It can't confirm anything. It doesn't have this extra thing, whatever it is that you want. It doesn't have that extra thing. And so now the question is, well, do you want to give up on your metaethical views as well, your error theory or your anti-realism?
Right, because I don't think error theory or anti-realism are themselves positions. They're conclusions of a different position, which is evolution. So with evolution, if we have good reason to believe evolution is true, and evolution produces these thoughts in brains, then we conclude, well, because we know this thing, and we already have this independent reason to believe this thing is true, it's already met the burden of proof, then we can conclude error theory, probably because that would be a better explanation of the data we have. So I don't think if we just posit error theory from an a priori position, kind of like moral realism, yes, they would be on equal terms, but we're not doing that. We're looking at the scientific data and saying, based on the scientific data, which has met this independent criterion, then we can conclude it's probably error theory or something along those lines. So I don't think those would be equivalent. It still seems like error theory would be more supported in that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, you keep saying like evolution is the best explanation for what our moral views are. I guess nobody's ever told that story. They just said like, oh, well, we evolved, and part of what we would evolve is like the capacity to make judgments about morality. That's definitely true, but that doesn't show that every one of our moral judgments is better explained by the fact that evolution did something to us. Because evolution gave us the inclination to make physical judgments, which we then use to make all sorts of really, really sophisticated physical judgments that we were never meant to make. Evolution fitted us with a inclination to make mathematical judgments, and then we used it to make all sorts of judgments about this reality independent of our mind that it never intended for us to. And then I would just want to say about evolution, yeah, evolution fitted us with the capacity to make moral judgments, definitely, and then we used it to do all sorts of more interesting and things that evolution never intended. In fact, to go against evolution, to not just have sex with any woman that you see and spread your seed as far as you can go, and not to eat as much calories as you possibly can, and not to kill your rivals when they take resources from you, and not to treat other people as though they're not your kin or whatever. So like we're doing all sorts of things against the inclination of evolution. And now everybody's like, and now I guess the move is going to be, yeah, but that's also explained explained by evolution. Maybe. Why isn't it that we're coming to discover the moral truths? Why isn't that the explanation for why we do all sorts of things counter to what evolution would incline us to believe and to do?
Well, because it seems like evolution produces both. It produces a lot of ideas that are good and beneficial to survival, and we can go against those all the time. Harry Potter, sacrifice virgins to the volcano. We can make up stuff all the time that goes against reality. Evolution gives us the ability to do both. And it seems like the ability to describe reality is the least likely thing our brain is capable of doing. We describe not reality far more often. And so if we're just looking at the data and we want to say that of all of the different beliefs evolution gives us, the highest likelihood is that it's one of the ones that does not describe reality. And so we have to start with the default that any idea we have probably does not describe reality, and we would need some additional metric to differentiate it from the imaginary ones. So yes, we get all of our ideas from evolution. Some of them don't describe reality. Some of them do. We can go against many of them, but the default here is that it's probably not real just based off of this fact. And we need a different reason to think it is real.
Yeah. So there's some sort of test that you are appealing to here. There's like, well, morality has to do this thing. Science apparently does it. It's not clear to me what exactly this thing is, but morality does it. And if we were able to sort of like, get in your brain and be able to pull that principle out and like look at it, I guess what I would want to ask is, all right, you got a principle that you think morality doesn't match up to. Cool. Now we have this other claim that's incompatible with that. It's just that it's morally wrong to burn people alive for the reading light that it provides. Now we need to make a judgment because those are incompatible and they both seem really clearly true. Actually, one of them seems really clearly true to me, that you shouldn't burn people alive for the reading light it provides. The other one, I don't even know what it is, but it doesn't sound super plausible to me. Then what I would do is, if I'm just making the comparative judgment, I'm going to go with, well, it's probably more likely that it's wrong to burn people alive than that this principle that you're appealing to, that science meets up with and morality doesn't meet up with, then that's correct. Every argument for error theory, for the view that there are no moral truths, depends on some claim in order to get to its conclusion. And these are always inevitably super controversial. Once you bring them to light, they're always like implicit in people's minds. But once you get them to bring it to light and you stare at it, once you see it sort of in full view, they're always like super implausible, or at least comparatively implausible compared to, say, certain putatively objective moral truths. So I guess I would say, in addition to the intuitive justification that we get for making judgments about particular cases, once you look at the arguments for error theory, they appeal to really controversial and really implausible upon inspection principles, like whatever the one that you're appealing to. It's not even clear to me which one it is, but whatever it is.
All right, so those don't seem to be contradictory. So yes, I agree. Science does have greater epistemic worth, better justified than morality. I agree with that, but that doesn't necessarily mean...
I didn't say that.
Well, you said there's this principle, science does it, morality doesn't, and it's morally wrong to burn people. I was saying
you have some principle that you think morality doesn't stand up to, but you think science does. We haven't really discovered what that principle is, other than just like something about predicting your future experiences.
Yes, novel testable predictions.
Building stuff.
So the way I phrase it is that all things in our minds start off as imaginary, conceptual things, and you need some way to differentiate the ones that don't correspond to reality and the ones that do. Science, novel testable predictions, is something I think does that, and I don't think morality has any way to do that.
Where'd you get this test? So this is the test, right? Where'd you get this test? Why is this the right test?
Because it has the most effects that we can see on reality, independent of our
effects that we can see. It's a principle about what you should believe in, or something like that. It doesn't have effects that you should see. It's like a normative principle. It's like, if a theory can do this particular thing, then you ought to believe in that theory and not the other one, or something like that. But that doesn't have effects. That's a normative principle.
I probably wouldn't use it as normative, but I'd say that using this method seems to make a lot of success at doing things in the world. Not using this method seems to have a lot of failure at doing things in the world. Therefore, I would go with the one that does the success.
Mm-hmm. And if I explain to you, there's a reason that this has success in the way that you describe, which is that it's a principle that's appropriate for descriptive disciplines, but it's not a principle that's appropriate for normative disciplines. So that's the mistake you're making. I'm claiming you're making a mistake. It's that you're taking a principle that may work fine for descriptive disciplines, but it doesn't work for normative disciplines, and you're misapplying it. It's like you're applying standards for a good washing machine and saying, But those same standards, when you apply them to cars, it says that all the cars are terrible. When you take the standards for a good washing machine and you apply them to cars, it turns out that all the cars are terrible. The right thing to say is, yeah, but it's a bad idea to take the goodness conditions for a washing machine and then apply them to cars. You should not do that. Instead, it has different success conditions, which you should look to, not to the ones for other things that are totally unrelated.
Right. So I would say the difference in success conditions are fine. So I'd say, like, if an analogy would be, if we have a hammer and hammer is the only tool humans have ever invented and hammers are very good at building houses, we're like, hammer good. And I'm saying, I'm going to trust the hammer, and the hammer can't do whatever you're talking about. But there's infinitely many things the hammer can't do. You just listed, mine can't do the hammer thing. Well, okay, give me a different thing it can do that's equivalent to the hammer. And if you can't do that, then it's equivalent to the infinitely many of other things that also can't do the hammer thing, which we don't have reason to believe.
Yeah. So why are people realists in the first place? Is that what you're wondering? Like, why did anybody ever do this? Well, it explains. Well, a lot of people think it's the best story about the normative domain. So a lot of people think they just sort of come to moral theorizing with this idea that lots of things are morally wrong.
Well, just to clarify, that's not quite what I was asking. So, like, we were talking about how I think there's this thing science does that morality doesn't, that makes it justified. It's like a hammer. The hammer is the methodology that justifies science, and there are infinitely many things the hammer cannot do. There's lots of different beliefs we have that the hammer cannot do. And you've presented one of these infinitely many beliefs and said, the hammer can't justify this. Well, okay, I agree. It can't justify any of those things. So I think all of them are unjustified. And then you mentioned there are these other reasons. You need other reasons that would essentially be equivalent to the hammer to make the belief in morality equivalent to the belief in science. And what are those other things that would be equivalent to the hammer?
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to explain. So, like, what does realism do? It doesn't predict things. We've already said it doesn't do that, but it's got to do something. That's your point. It's got to do something. Tell me what it does. Yeah, it makes the most sense of our moral experience. So, what does that mean? Well, most people they sort of come to philosophy and this seems right. They sort of take it as data. Some things are right, some things are wrong. Now, maybe we'll have to revise that. Maybe we'll have to throw that out in the end. But at least most people come to, before they ever took a philosophy class, it seems like some things are wrong. The Holocaust was wrong. Throwing people off buildings is wrong. It's right to, give a little bit of your income to the global poor or to people who need it. Okay, fair enough. Now we want to understand that. What's the best explanation for that? Maybe, or what's the best story about that domain? Maybe it's that there's no truths at all, but maybe there are truths. So when people consider whether or not you should throw people off buildings because it's fun to watch them splatter. Now, a lot of people think that would be wrong, even if you like watching it splatter. And now the question is, would it be wrong because I don't like it? Well, no, we've built into the case that I do like it. I like throwing people off buildings and watching them splatter. It's fun. Okay, is it wrong because my society condemns it? At least when I consider that particular case, now I'm imagining a case in which all of society sort of is okay with me throwing people off buildings, or another person throwing people off buildings. It's not me. I'm sort of considering that case. I think, no, that doesn't, that it would still be wrong in that case. And then I consider lots of other people's whose judgments may, they may condemn that thing. Do their judgments make it wrong? No. So then it seems like the best explanation is that this is wrong independent of anyone's attitudes. So that would make sense of the intellectual appearances there. Now, we're not done with metaethics yet, but that's the starting point for why would someone think there are stance-independent moral facts? It's because they become thinking there are moral facts, and then when we consider all the stances that might explain why those are the moral facts, none of them make sense. So it must be that there are stance-independent moral facts.
What do you mean by make sense in that context? So because you said that this moral realism makes the most sense of things.
Well, it's the best story about why I have the judgments that I do. Not only should I not do it in this case, I shouldn't throw somebody off buildings just because, I want to do it. I shouldn't do it even if lots of other people condemn it or approve of it. It doesn't really matter what their approvals or disapprovals of my throwing people off buildings are. I still shouldn't do it. What would explain why I have those judgments in all those various cases? I'm saying the best explanation for why I have those judgments is because what I'm seeing is that it stands independently wrong to do those things. When I consider the reasons to do this or that, it doesn't look like it depends on anyone's judgments about what I have reason to do.
So what exactly do you mean by best story, or what best makes sense of things? What is the criterion that we're using?
So I have these judgments about moral cases, lots of them.
Yes.
Now, maybe I'm massively deluded. Or maybe I have good judgments. And typically when I think about things, I'm not like, anti-reliable such that every time I think about something, I come to the wrong conclusion. Far from it. For the most part, when I think about things and reach conclusions, I get them right. Now, I'm not perfect, but I've managed to stay alive for 35 years or so. So when I think about things and I make a judgment, I typically get them right. Can get them wrong for sure, but now I make judgments about all these cases. So what's a better explanation for why I'm making those judgments? Is it that I'm getting the truth about these things right? Or is it that I'm deeply deluded? I claim the best explanation for why I have these judgments is that I'm apprehending the moral truths that are independent of my mind. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was at least an attempt.
Not really, because you've used best in the answer. So I'm like, how do you determine which one is better?
Best? Yeah. Well, I mean, so then we just weigh up the reasons. So what reasons do I have to think that I'm deluded about these cases? Maybe I'm wrong. So I judge that I should save people, and I should save people even if everybody tells me I shouldn't save them from a drowning pond or whatever. And even if God told me don't do it, I think I should still do it. And even if everybody told me don't save that kid, I just should still do it. Okay, so it doesn't look like it depends on anybody's judgments. And now so now I want to know, is there a reason that I have to think that I'm deeply deluded about this? I don't see any. And I tend to get things right when I reflect on these things. So probably I'm getting things right. That's the sense. Probably it's a probabilistic judgment given the evidence that I have about my experience.
So you said you have to weigh up the reasons, and that's how you determine which one's best. And you said the reasons are the feelings themselves that you have on reflection, that it's independent.
It's not feelings. It's not like, ooh, my feelings. It's like intellectual appearance. So when you consider whether if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, is A identical to C? So let me say that again. If I've just told you A is identical to B.
Transitive property, yes.
Yeah, you got it. Okay. So when you consider that little thing right there, you just sort of think about it and you can see, yeah, A must be identical to C. It's not a feeling. It's not like you like, oh, that makes me feel good. It's an intellectual seeming or an intellectual appearance. And that's the sense in which when I consider these cases, I don't get mad about these cases. They're fake cases that I made up. So it's not like I have feelings about that. Like I get angry when in my mind, I imagine these cases. They're intellectual seemings.
Right. I think, I would agree there's a difference between like 1 + 1 = 2 and I like chocolate or something. But why would we think that morality is more like the transitive property rather than I like chocolate?
Because we're doing, well, what do you mean? So we're doing, all I meant to say is like the transitive property it's like an intellectual seeming. So when you consider the transitive property, it seems to you that A is identical to C when you reflect on it. And similarly, when you consider moral cases, it seems to you that certain acts are right or wrong. And it just seems to you that way. It's sort of presented to you when you consider the case. So why is it not like tasting? Well, at least one difference it's like not like tasting is that it's not a physical sensation. When you taste stuff, like you have a sensation in your body. But when you consider cases in moral philosophy, you don't have sensations in your body unless unless you're counting sensations as like intellectual seemings that happen every time you do philosophy. When you consider certain principles and how plausible they are, when you consider arguments and you consider how strong or weak they are, those are all appealing to intellectual seemings that you have, and that's what you're doing when you're doing moral philosophy. It's not like taste in the sense that you're not getting any sort of bodily sensations.
I don't think the bodily thing matters here, because the question is like, there are many sensations we have that are just feelings, like taste or whatever. I don't know what the best example would be, but there are many sensations that we get or feel. I'd call them feelings, just anything that we have an inclination towards this thing is true, which really isn't. It's just something we made up based on our psychology. Harry Potter is cooler than Draco or whatever. I have a feeling that he's cooler. It doesn't correspond to me. There's no like objective coolness measure. It's just a thing that my brain is made up because it likes this set of properties more than this set of properties. And that would be more like taste or whatever. It's just analogous to the thing our brain is made up. And that's different from things like math or logic or the transitive property, which are not things my brain made up. And so why would we think morality is of the second case rather than the first?
So, I mean, I could run you through some different arguments. Suppose I believe in realism just because it comforts me. I would be very sad if realism were false. And so I don't like that. That makes me feel bad. So I believe in realism. What would your reaction to me be?
Subjective? It's subjective.
Yeah, but I mean, would you want to criticize me, or would you be like, well, that's stupid. Or would you want to adopt the view that I just described? You should believe in realism because it feels really good.
No, I would say that the reason you provided was a subjective reason and you're making an objective claim, so it just literally doesn't, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise.
Yeah, and you shouldn't believe it because it's stupid. And it's like, and you should criticize me for making stuff up, for believing things just because I feel like believing them or because they're comforting to me. A lot of people, I take it, a lot of people in your audience would criticize, they criticize theists, for instance, who, they think believe things for really stupid reasons. That the theist thinks they have good reasons to believe something, but presumably you and their audience think they don't have good reasons. They're screwing up. And
well, just to clarify, I think it's, if you want to believe something because it makes you feel good, I think that's perfectly fine, perfectly logical. I just don't think if you're making the claim that you have evidence and you don't have evidence, that's illogical because you said you have something you don't have. But if you just believe because you want to have belief, or you just believe because you have faith, I have no problem with that. Perfectly fine. So
I mean, you're not gonna beat them up or anything. But don't you think they're making a mistake of some kind?
Like if you openly admit that the only reason I believe is because it makes me feel good, I'm like, that's fine. That's perfectly logical, reasonable thing to do. Unless you make the actual claim, I have evidence. Here is some objective empirical evidence, and then it's not. That's where I think someone has made a mistake, where they think they have evidence and they don't have evidence. But if they just claim they have faith, like that's fine. Like my conversation with Pete ends, we go all the way through that.
Yeah. So, I mean, so this was just to sort of as a lead in to try to explain, you asked like, why would anybody believe that there are these truths out there? I mean, one is because a lot of people, whether they want to say it or not, on reflection, they might say, oh no, you can do that if you want. But a lot of people do go around condemning people for being irrational, for not regulating their beliefs in accord with the evidence. And so what they're implicitly committed to is the existence of objective epistemic facts. So facts about how you ought to conduct your beliefs independent of your attitudes. Even if you like believing really stupid stuff, you still shouldn't do it. Even if you like holding beliefs with no evidence at all, you shouldn't. At least a lot of people think. And so that's one way to sort of get into an argument for realism about morality. It just says if there are objective epistemic facts, and you might think that there are, if you think that there are ways that people ought to conduct their beliefs. If they're objective epistemic facts, then they're objective moral facts, because if you already let in objective epistemic facts, not clear why there wouldn't be objective moral facts. But there are objective epistemic facts. Some people are making a mistake independent of their attitudes when they believe stupid stuff. So they're objective moral facts. That is, moral realism is true. That's one way. That's sort of a direct answer to your question. That's the sort of companions and guilt argument, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Right. So that'd be like a pure argument that if there are these things, that there's this should statement that you should like proportion your beliefs to the evidence or whatever, these objective epistemic claims, then objective moral claims would be equivalent to those in some sense, or analogous to those in some sense.
No more metaphysically or epistemologically problematic. So it's not clear why they wouldn't be there when we already think they are there.
Right. So when you say that there are these objective epistemic norms that we should proportion our belief to the evidence or whatever they are, what do you mean by objective here?
Stance independent. So it doesn't depend on so the reason that you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence isn't because I say so, or it's not because I like that norm, or it's not because like our society got together one time and agreed that that's going to be the norm and we wrote it down on paper. Everyone should proportion their belief to the evidence. It's not because God commanded you to proportion your belief to the evidence. It's not because there's some ideal observer who was thinking about which moral truths to approve of and disapprove of, and he approved of proportion your belief to the evidence. No, none of that explains why you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence. You ought to proportion your belief to the evidence independent of anyone's judgment, even your own or anybody else's. That's the thought.
Why? How do you make the measurement there that you ought to do this? What is making that measurement?
You asked me what stance independence was, and
yes.
That was the answer. The answer is it doesn't depend on anybody's.
Right. Attitude. So I'm asking how would you conclude that such a thing is stance independent? Like you're saying, you ought to do this independent of any views. Yeah, I grant that's the definition of stance independent, but why should we think it is stance independent? Like how do we conclude that, for example, this epistemic norm is stance independent?
Let's take the norms. You ought to proportion your belief to the evidence. Okay. It's stance independence if the truth of that normative claim doesn't depend on anyone's attitudes.
Right.
So now we go around looking for attitudes. Let's see whose attitudes would sort of make this claim true. And then I ask, is it my attitudes that make this claim true? Is it God's attitudes? And then we just go looking around for any sort of attitudes, any sort of set of attitudes that could make that claim true. Presumably we're both committed to that claim. You ought to proportion your belief to the evidence. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. But for the purpose of this argument, let's suppose you are committed to that. You ought to proportion your belief to the evidence. And then we go around, and it doesn't seem plausible that there's that claim is true because some agent believes or approves of that principle. it looks like there's no explanation other than just that you ought to do it independent of anyone's attitudes. That's the thought. So if you wonder how do you get to stance independence, it's because you look for all the stances and you find that none of them are plausible.
Right. So I didn't want to beg the question there and just assume that it was true. Like, I don't think that statement is true. I don't think it's true that you should proportion your belief to the evidence. I think it's preferable, like a hypothetical imperative. I like it better, but I don't think it's like there's no like categorical truth there. So why would we think that has some kind of categorical truth value?
Well, in what sense? So I guess I would ask you, you think it's true that you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence?
Hypothetical imperative. So like, just because I like it, no other reason.
Oh, so it is your attitudes that make it true because you like it.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. Do you really think that's what makes it true though? Do you think like the fact that I like it?
Well, no, it's not, because I'm a correspondence theory of truth guy, so I don't think it corresponds to anything in reality. I just think I like it better, and so it makes me feel good, and so there's no truth value to it. It's
cool. Yeah. So great. So you could take that attitude towards the norm that you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence, that it's a one that I like. But then, of course, you lose any sort of ground to criticize other people for failing to meet the norm. But here's another thing. Now you say you sort of were implicitly committed to this idea. If I like some epistemic principle and I'm sort of committed to acting in accordance with it or believing in accordance with it, then that's the one for me. That's the kind of epistemic standards I should have. The ones that I like. Is that roughly correct? Or how would you?
Well, I'd say pick what makes you happy, essentially. Like, I don't think there's a should there. I don't think it's just do what makes you happy because you're going to do it. There's no should there.
Yeah. So take the pick what makes you. So yeah, it's like an imperative, like pick what makes you happy. It's not true.
No, like I would have no should or normativity there at all. I'd say, like, if you want to pick one that you don't want, that doesn't make you happy, go for it and pick whatever you want to pick. I don't think there's a should value to it. It's just different operating systems. I don't think there's a better or worse, Microsoft or Apple. Like pick whatever.
Yeah, good. So if they're all roughly equal, then basically it looks like you don't have any beef with realists who want to believe realism because they like it or whatever. It seems like that's cool.
Yeah, like I said, if you want to believe in God just because you want to believe in it, that's perfectly fine. So, but my question is more for the people who don't think that's enough. They think that we want evidence. We want some way, we need some additional way to differentiate imagination from reality. Is there any such way other than just I want to believe it?
Yeah, I got two more arguments for you. But you should know that if what you're saying is like, give me the evidence, is point to something empirical, again, I'm going to say, sorry, that's a mistake. You're taking standards from science and trying to apply them here. Big mistake, like taking standards for washing machines and applying them to cars. You're making a mistake. Right,
okay. Absolutely. I want to clarify that the reason I bring up that is just because it's something I accept as, and like the hammer, you can bring up any other tool. If you can provide any way you want to differentiate imagination from reality. That was less for you and more
for the audience. Sorry.
Yeah.
That was less for you more. Yeah. Okay, great. So one way you might go is something like an ontological argument for moral truths. This is one from Michael Huemer, and I like my own version of it. This isn't exactly as they present it, but Christian Coons and Michael Huemer have written papers on this, and it basically just starts with the metaphysical possibility of stance-independent normative truths. So the moral truths are the kinds of things that, if they're true in all possible worlds. That's just what, like, take utilitarianism or Kantianism. It's not as though no one thinks that those theories are true in this particular world and no other world, or in like one or two worlds and no other worlds. They think that if you ought to maximize utility, you ought to maximize utility in whatever world you're in. It's not like a contingent claim. So here's how it works. If it's metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths, then there actually are stance-independent moral truths. And it is metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths. Therefore, there are stance-independent moral truths. So let's just consider those two premises, because there's only two premises and then the conclusion. You've seen this before.
Yep.
I'm sure your audience has seen its ontological arguments before. What I like about this one is that it has none of the God is the greatest conceivable being or something like. There's no appeals to greatness or necessary existence like smuggled into the nature of the thing. It's everybody always thought that's it's sort of like part of the concept of a moral theory, that it applies in all possible worlds. It doesn't just happen to be true that killing this person without justification is wrong. It's wrong anywhere it happens. Okay. So the first premise says, if it's metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths, then there actually are stance-independent moral truths. That's just, you've probably seen that before, but it basically, because moral truths are supposed to be metaphysically necessary, then if it's even possible, if they're true in one world, they're true in all worlds. That's largely agreed upon. Here's the controversial one. It is metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths. And for that one, two things to say. The first one is that most of the arguments against realism are they just try to show that realism is improbable. They don't try to show that it's impossible. There's no argument that you couldn't possibly have a stance independent moral truth.
Well, the objection there isn't that moral realism is impossible. It's that it would necessarily or not necessarily be the same in all worlds. So, for example, you can have an objective moral realism of like a god in one world, a law of physics, a platonic object in a different world. So you can have moral realism be true in each world independently, and some of them it's not true in. And so my problem with the ontological argument is that it says it's possible that there is this property that applies to all possible worlds, and it's possible it exists in one possible world, and it's conflating the idea that, well, it doesn't address the idea that, well, no, maybe it's just possible in that one possible world and not in a different one. So it could be the case that there is moral realism in one possible world, but it's also possible there is no overriding moral realism in all possible worlds.
Yeah, so to grant that like some moral theory is true in one world and not another is just to fail to recognize the content of the moral theory itself. So the moral theories basically come with a necessarily attached to the beginning. Necessarily, you ought to maximize utility. That is, in all possible worlds, you ought to maximize utility. It's like built into the nature of these moral theories. Same thing with virtue ethics, same thing with Kantianism or any contractualism. Any of the normative ethical theories have like a necessarily built into them. And so it's sort of like impossible for it to be true in one world and not any others because it's built into the content of the theory that it's a necessary truth.
Right. So I would say
the way that you say, which
is so I would say that
in one world and not another.
Based on the definition of objective, true, independent of opinion or whatever, you can have objective morality, moral realism in a universe without having it true in all possible universes. So even if some person defines their version of moral realism as being necessarily true in all possible worlds, you can still have an objective moral realism in one world that is not in another just fine. So it seems to be a conflation between the terms there of trying to define into moral realism that it must be necessary in all possible worlds. I don't think that's the case. I don't think moral realism would need to be in all possible worlds. I think it's perfectly fine to have different moralities in different worlds, like platonic objects. Say you have platonic moral object A and then platonic moral object B in a different world. I don't see any logical contradiction with that. Therefore, the second premise would be false, because if it is logically possible to have two different platonic moral objects in two different worlds that have two different moralities, that would prove premise 2 false, that a metaphysically necessary morality would, in all possible worlds, is necessary.
Good. Yeah, you said, why couldn't there be platonic object A in this world and and not in other worlds, and platonic object B in this world and not other worlds? There's no contradiction here, but there is, because it fails to understand what an abstract object is or what a platonic object is. They're the kinds of things whose existence don't depend on anything about what the world is like. They're sort of abstract in the sense that they can exist no matter what the world is like. They exist, and it's sort of part of the nature of an abstract object that it exists in all possible worlds, because they don't depend for their existence on anything else. That's what it is to be. That's why numbers exist in all possible worlds. It's not as though there are some worlds where the number 3 doesn't exist, but it exists in other worlds, or where a certain proposition exists in one world, or a certain possibility exists in one world, but not another world, at least a metaphysical possibility. That's because it's the nature of these abstract objects to exist in all possible worlds. So it is a contradiction. It is like a conceptual mistake to say it exists. This abstract object exists in this world and no other world.
I don't see it as a logical contradiction. You can definitely have some abstract objects that only exist in some worlds. They don't necessarily need to exist in all possible worlds. And like math, I would think it's logically contradictory that math or logic wouldn't apply to any existing world, but it doesn't seem like that's the case with morality. So it seems to me that yes, it is logically possible to have some abstract objects that don't exist in all possible worlds. I don't see why that would be contradictory.
Sorry, the last thing you said is you think it's not contradictory that there are abstract objects that exist in some worlds and not others?
No, there's some abstract objects only exist in some possible worlds. So there could be some abstract objects that must necessarily exist in all of them, math and logic, for example, but that wouldn't necessarily apply to all abstract objects. It could be the case that some abstract objects only exist or only apply to one universe, one world.
Okay, let's suppose that's right. So for instance, you might think that like certain artworks like Fahrenheit 451 or something like that, that's a novel, and it can be instantiated in many different places, but you might think it was created. Fahrenheit 451 is an abstract object that was created or something like that. So that might be a case where an abstract object can exist in one world but not another. But there's an easy explanation for why Fahrenheit 451 can exist in some worlds and not others. And that's because Ray Bradbury, who's the guy who wrote it, would exist in some worlds and not others. But for some abstract objects, we would want to know, well, what would prevent them from existing? So take the number 2. It doesn't look like 2 could fail to exist in any world. If it exists, it couldn't fail to exist in any world. It would necessarily exist if it exists at all, because what on earth could prevent the number 2 from existing? Doesn't seem like anything could. So it exists in all possible worlds, if it exists at all. And the same thing with the moral truths. So let's suppose utilitarianism is true. What could prevent utilitarianism from being true? It doesn't look like anything. You can arrange the world any way you like. That's not going to falsify utilitarianism. There's no way to make it false because it's a theory about how you ought to act. It says you ought to maximize utility. So why think that if utilitarianism is true, it's necessarily true? Because nothing could, if it's true in one world, nothing could prevent it from being true in any other world. You could arrange the world any way you like, and it's not going to prevent utilitarianism from being true.
I don't see that. So like, for example, if there's a God and God, let's say divine command theory is the moral realism of this universe, and it says God, whatever God says is what you ought to do, and God disagrees with utilitarianism, therefore utilitarianism is false, not moral realism in that universe. There's a different moral realism that's true in that universe.
Yeah, what you just supposed, though, is that a certain kind of anti-realism is true, or a certain kind of constructivism, according to, that's divine command theory, the view according to which the rightness and wrongness facts are constructed out of God's commands.
Oh, I could go with God's nature. I could say, let's say God's nature in universe A is grounds morality, and God's nature does not correspond to utilitarianism, therefore it's false.
Yeah. So then I would just say that the scenario you presented, the one where, God's nature grounds the moral truths and utilitarianism is true, grounds the moral truths, that those couldn't possibly be true in the same world. And that's because they're going to have inconsistent judgments about what's right and wrong.
Right, but they could be different worlds, remember? Different worlds, one
so you just have 2 different worlds, right?
Yep.
Yeah. But then what I'll say is, look, if one of them is, they're both such that if they're true in one world, they're true in all worlds. And so it's impossible for one of them to be true in one world and one to be true in another. That's because they're both the kinds of things that, if true, are necessarily true.
Well, what you asked was, what could make utilitarianism false? And if you said, if utilitarianism is true in all possible worlds, what could make that false? There's a different possible world where God's nature grounds it, and that would then make utilitarianism false. So that was the point.
Okay, great. Well, then, yeah, great. And in that case, then what I'd say is, fair enough. We don't need, so the only thing that could make utilitarianism false is if some other stance-independent morality is true. And we're just arguing about realism here. So in that case, if you say, well, I can think of something that would make utilitarianism false, and it would be, another realistic theory being true. And then I'd say, oh, fine. That's fair enough. In that case, then, realism is going to be true in every possible world. We just don't know which one it is. Maybe it's going to be something about God's nature. Maybe it's going to be utilitarianism. But it's not as though you're going to have one world in which one theory is true and one world in which another is true.
Well, that was the defeating point there, is that you can. I think that I don't see a logical problem with having one world where utilitarianism is true, one world where God's nature is true. Those seem to be possible worlds. Those are each possible worlds. Now, it becomes impossible if you simply define into their nature that it must be in all possible worlds. But I don't see that as significant in any way. I don't like.
So no, that's crucial, because that's part of what the concept of morality is. It's the kind of thing about how you ought to act, about what reasons you have, and if it's stance independent, if none of these depend on anybody's stance, then they're true no matter what anybody else thinks, which means that the way you arrange the world can't stop them from being true. So they're the kinds of things that, if true in one world, are true in all the worlds. That's sort of the nature of the concept. Now you might think, now, it sounds like you think, oh, well, that's ad hoc. You're just saying that. No, that's the supervenience thesis that literally everyone in ethics endorses. That is, if some set of descriptive properties are instantiated, then it has a certain moral property. And anytime those descriptive conditions are met, the moral property comes on top, or it sort of follows as a result. That's a supervenience thesis. And it says that if a moral truth is true in one world, anytime those descriptive conditions are also met, you get the same moral truth in every possible world. So it's not like an ad hoc add-on. It's sort of a thesis that everyone in ethics accepts. Even like anti-realists, they use supervenience to try to argue against realism. Everybody accepts it.
If the descriptive properties are the same.
That's right.
So if you change the descriptive properties,
the theory doesn't depend on the descriptive properties.
What?
The truth of the theory of the general theory doesn't depend on what the descriptive properties are right.
Right.
Just whether some moral property is instantiated in certain conditions, that's going to depend on the descriptive conditions.
Right. So let's say we have two universes and they each have a God and they have different natures. So they disagree with one another. And so the principles are, if you have this in world A with God's nature A, you should do A. And in world B, where you have God's nature B, you should do B. Those are not, that the superveillance principle can still apply there because they're different. There are different descriptive facts of those worlds. And you can have one fact of if God says so, it's moral, and that fact could be true in both worlds. And even though the particular thing God says or God's nature inclines is different, the supervenience principle still applies. So it wouldn't violate the supervenience principle to have a morality based on God's nature or God's commands, either one doesn't matter, and have two different gods in two different worlds.
Well, the supervenience thesis applies to all possible worlds. So you're saying that it applies only in this world, but that's just to deny the supervenience thesis. That's just to say, yes, I accept supervenience, except I'm going to deny one of the crucial features, which is that it applies to all possible worlds.
No, I'm granting. So I'm granting the supervenience principle. I'm saying the supervenience principle is true, and the moral objective truth is do what God's nature says to do, or whatever. And there's two gods, one God, universe A, one God, universe B. So the supervenience principle applies to everything. It's all possible worlds. Do what God's nature does, or whatever. And
I see. Yeah.
Now it applies differently in both worlds, even though the supervenience principle is still true.
Yeah, then it's going to depend on on somebody's attitudes, because, it's about the nature. It's about do whatever God's nature says or something like that.
Yeah, or his commands, either one doesn't make a difference. You could just be any property of. Go ahead.
Yeah, but then it looks like realism is true because the claim do whatever God's nature says is true in all possible worlds, and that's the stance independent truth. So it would be a vindication of realism. Do whatever God's nature says. That's true in literally all possible worlds.
Sure.
On the story that you've just told.
Sure.
So that's realism.
Okay, but the point was that you can have different things you should do in two different worlds. So if it's do whatever God's nature is, and God's nature is the determining factor, there's a difference in that universe. There's a fact in that universe which determines which actions you should do or shouldn't do. And that can be objective in one world, but it changes in a different world. So don't kill babies maybe in one and kill babies in a different one.
But here, the facts about God's nature are part of the descriptive facts, and those are different. They're not the exact same. So the two worlds you've described don't have the exact same descriptive facts.
Yep.
Because they're different gods
and
different natures. And that's part of the explanation for why the moral properties are different.
Sure. I'm happy to grant that. So
that's just to say the supervenience thesis on the story you've told isn't falsified. It's not as though the supervenience thesis is in good shape. Realism is in good shape. You could have two different kinds of gods. The stance independent moral truth is do what this God's nature is like. And you have, an unjustified, you have a killing in one case and an identical killing in the other. And they have different moral properties, but that's all fine because there are still different descriptive properties in those worlds, namely the facts about the God's nature.
Right. So but it still doesn't seem like there could be a world with none of that. So there's a world with, if the supervenience principle is do whatever the moral object or moral nature says to do, and there is no moral object in world A, there's no other than the supervenience principle. There's no other morality in world A.
Oh, I see. So it's godless. Or the moral truth is do what God's nature tells you to do, and there's no God there to determine the facts. Yeah, good. What would you do in that case? Well, it would still be a moral truth that what you ought to do is what God's nature commands you to do. It's just the case that there is no God here. But it's still the fact that if there were a God here, then you ought to do according to its nature. But there just isn't a God here.
Okay, and that seems to work.
But so this is one reason to think that that's not going to be the fundamental moral principle. Because presumably take a world in which there is no God, there's probably still murders. It just isn't plausible that in that world it's not wrong to murder. That's one reason to reject the meta-ethical claim that the truths depend on, what God's nature is or something like that. Because maybe you could have a world without God's nature. The theists are going to deny that because they think God exists necessarily. But suppose you could have a world in which God doesn't exist, then murder would be fine in that world. But that's just a reason to think that, well, I guess that means that it couldn't be a truth of morality, that you ought to do whatever God's nature says if God's nature could fail to exist.
Okay. Sally asks, why wouldn't we just take the position that moral facts are impossible? That the fact that there is this moral norm in all possible worlds is just impossible.
Well, you could say that, but then you need a reason. So suppose I just said, it's impossible that error theory is true. I said it, but I would need a reason to think that it's false. I've given this ontological argument to think that it couldn't possibly be the case that the error theory is true. And there are other Morean arguments or companions in guilt arguments or indispensability arguments, right? Those are sort of arguments. So I guess I would want to hear more about why you think that it's impossible for the stance. You could say it, but the question is, do you have a justification for it?
Any possible justification for it being true can be reflected in an anti-argument that is equally as plausible.
say more about, so that shows that stance independent moral facts are impossible. That doesn't sound like it. I didn't hear that where the impossibility would come in.
It's just a mirroring argument. So any argument for moral realism being possible would equally work for it being impossible. So like saying the ontological argument for morality could equally apply to the ontological morality or ontological argument for some other thing we think is good that is counter to morality. So think of the why say that it's possible that morality is all possible worlds? Why not say it's possible that anti-morality is in all possible worlds?
Right. Good. Yeah. Or just say it's possible that there aren't moral truths. There aren't moral. So that's that's sort of it's not quite a parody, but it's sort of a standard objection to the ontological argument. So the possibility premise says it's possible that God exists, or it's possible that there's stance independent morality. And the way to combat it is to say, yeah, but it's possible God doesn't exist, or it's possible there aren't stance independent truths about morality. Great. So now we have this premise. Everything hinges on which one is true, because if the possibility premise is true, then there are stance independent moral facts. And if the possibility premise is false, then there aren't. And now we need to know which one is more likely true. So now we got to make a probability judgment. Which one is more probably true? There's not, so either way we go, we're just going to have a probabilistic claim here, but that's often all you get in philosophy. You're not going to get like a certainty about this or that. So I claim that it's metaphysically possible that there are stance independent moral truths is more justified than the claim that it's impossible. And why is that? Well, because it doesn't seem like there's anything incoherent about the notion of a stance independent moral truth. In order to say that it's impossible for there to be such things, we need to think of some reason. What would prevent there from being a stance independent moral truth in some world? It doesn't look like there's anything that could prevent it. It's not as though somebody say so could prevent it. It's not as though if God shows up and says, well, I don't want there to be stance independent moral truths, he could prevent it. It's not the kind of thing that God can sort of control. It's not the kind of thing that you or I can control because it's stance independent. It's not the kind of thing that abstract objects can control. Propositions couldn't stop there from being stance independent moral truths. The number 2 couldn't stop there from being stance independent moral truths. So it seems like it's a perfectly coherent notion. Things that are perfectly coherent, there's at least a prima facie reason to think that they could exist. And now we need some reason to think they couldn't exist. What's a reason to think they're impossible? And I don't see any reason to think they're impossible. It doesn't seem like anything could prevent them from existing. So I think it's much more probably true that it is possible that there are stance independent moral truths than that it's literally impossible.
So why couldn't we just say there's this plurality? Say there's morality, and then there's this other possible non-incoherent principle that's plurality, which is just not morality. So it's not morality, and it says morality is just some different thing to replace morality that does kill all babies or whatever, just something not moral. Yeah. And we could say this principle is equally as incoherent. It could be ontologically real in all possible worlds too, and it is the antithesis of morality or whatever, or something that invalidates morality, and that's just as possible. There's no difference between this and the moral argument.
Yeah, so what I need to know, I'm trying to assess the possibility of plurality, right? That's what we're trying to do here. You said, oh, I could just say plurality, right? And now we want to know, isn't that possible? Well, unclear. Tell me more about plurality. Because what happens a lot in these parity arguments is that it turns out that they're either describing something that's literally incoherent, for instance, like a non-physical pizza or something like that. Like, could God, create a pizza so big he couldn't eat it? Eventually it gets to like, well, what about it's a non-physical pizza? But then it's like, I don't know if there is such a thing as a non-physical pizza. For instance, pizzas typically have like cheese and bread, and those are physical things. So now you tell me about plurality. My guess is that what you're going to end up describing is morality, but you're just calling it plurality. And then I'll say, yeah, plurality is possible. That's because it's a name that you gave to morality. And then that just vindicates the ontological argument. But tell me more about plurality. I suspect it's either going to be incoherent so that it couldn't possibly exist, or you're just talking about morality, and then the ontological argument goes through.
It's literally a property that destroys all morality in every possible world. Morality gone. Bye-bye.
Destroys morality.
That prevents it from existing, an anti-morality particle, just whatever, just can't be morality.
Yeah. So can you say more about how it prevents morality from occurring? So, because what I suggested was, it doesn't look like there's anything that could prevent it from occurring. I mean, we need some mechanism. What's the mechanism by which it prevents morality from occurring? Like I said, if it's about stance-independent attitude or stance-independent truths, our stances can't prevent the stance-independent truths from being real. Numbers couldn't, because they're causally inefficacious, so abstract objects couldn't prevent them. It doesn't look like anything could. Now, you could just say, but I'm making up a thing that could. But but you can't just say that. You need to describe, how does it do it? Like, what's the story about how it prevents morality from existing?
Right. So I would ask you, how do you assert that morality can't be wrong? And then I would essentially just mirror that. So to me, it seems like your assertion that there is nothing that could make morality wrong seems unjustified. I don't see why that would be the case.
There's there's no incoherence. So possibility is pretty cheap. I just wanted to vindicate the possibility premise. I want to say it's possible that there are stance independent moral truths. Possibility comes pretty cheap. For the most part, if it's a coherent thing, then you could have it. A gold mountain could exist. Is there a gold mountain? I don't know, but it's possible that there are gold mountains. A seven-headed dog, could there be such a thing? Yeah, sure, of course. It doesn't seem like there's any reason to think there couldn't. Could there be reasons for you to act in this way or that, independent of your attitudes? At least it seems initially that that there could be such a thing, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I'd love to hear reasons to think that that couldn't possibly exist. If you have them, I'm all ears, but I don't know of anything that could stop them because they're stance independent truths. So they don't depend on stances or the way the world is or abstract objects. So what could prevent them from existing?
Well, again, so like if you have some object A of stance independent truths and some object A of the antithesis to that, the not stance independent truths, and then you have some like agnosticism where there's neither, it seems like all three of those are equally likely.
Yeah. What do you mean by not stance independent moral truth? What does that mean?
Well, it seems like moral truths are a thing that we've made up and we've asserted exist, property A. Now, I don't see any coherent description of what these are, so it's just completely arbitrary or ambiguous, whatever that means. And I'm saying in whatever realm those exist, there could be multiple different kinds of objects. And of those objects, there could be an anti-moral object that is equally as coherent as the moral object. So I don't see any way in which you could say that these stance-independent moral truths exist, because it seems like you can't give a description of how or why or what that means. And equally, I can't give a description of how or why the anti-moral particle exists. But it doesn't seem like that's a criticism of either position because they both have that same problem.
Yeah, and that same problem is you don't know what they are. Is that the idea?
I don't know how they could exist.
Problem?
Don't know how they could exist in the way that you're describing.
Yeah. So do you think abstract objects could exist?
Sure.
Yeah. So if so they exist in the same way that abstract objects exist. So in the way that the number 2 exists, or possibilities exist, or blueness exists. That's the sense in which the moral truths exist. So if you understand abstract objects, then I claim that you understand what it would be for it to be true, or for utilitarianism to be correct, the correct moral theory. It would just be this abstract truth about reality, just like it's possible that there's a 7-headed dog. Where do we see that? Where can we touch that truth? We can't touch that truth, but it's still a truth about reality. It's a truth about reality. There could be a 7-headed dog. None of us have ever seen that truth. None of us have ever touched that truth, and yet it's a truth. And I claim that if utilitarianism is true, I'm just throwing out a normative theory, but if utilitarianism is true, it's true in the same way that it's possible that there's a 7-headed dog. It's a truth about the world.
Right, and it seems like we could assert some kinds of abstract objects that don't exist. It's possible there's an abstract object of Blurple, the Blurple abstract object or whatever, and somebody could come along and say, that's ridiculous. Why are you're just asserting a random abstract object as if it's possible to exist? Like, okay, I'll assert a different abstract object that takes the place of Blurple. It occupies all of the abstract spaces Blurple would occupy, and it's the ploop. The ploop abstract object. So, the ploop abstract object.
We actually can't assess whether Blurple is real or not. We don't know what it refers to or what it attempts to refer to. So we can't just say, Blurple doesn't exist. We don't know what's being claimed about it. So we have to assess whether or not this thing could possibly exist. And that's why I'm asking you for more about blurality, because before I can assess whether blurality is possible, I need you to tell me more about it. Similarly with Blurple. If Blurple is just a name that you gave to the number 2, then I think Blurple could exist and does exist. But if Blurple refers to a round square, then I think it couldn't exist, and it couldn't exist because it's an incoherent concept.
Right, but
you couldn't have those two things at once.
Right.
So you gotta spell more about what blurality is or Blurple is before we can assess whether it's possible or not.
Well, the point is here we can just assert. Well, the point is we can assert things as abstract objects that aren't. They're just things we've made up. They're not abstract objects, right? And it's possible that there are, if you make an argument for this, an asserted abstract object, you can just say it's in all possible worlds, but I can just say it's not, or make up a different abstract object that would occupy the same abstract space, and so it would replace all of the possible worlds of this first abstract object. All this is just made up. None of this is supported. So the possibility.
What I'm suggesting is
Well,
When you're just making up abstract objects?
Yes,
Which
but
you can
just to
do?
clarify, this is why the ontological argument fails, is because you've made up an abstract object. Anybody can make up a different abstract object that could replace the first abstract object. Both are just made up abstract objects. Neither actually could be shown in any way to apply to all possible worlds via the ontological argument, because it works for both equally. And so the ontological argument does not seem to work in either case for any made up abstract object. You would need to indicate that it is actually abstract in a different way than the ontological argument first.
That second part is what I'm denying. So you said you could just make up any abstract object. I'm claiming that's false. You can't just make up. And when I ask you to do it, and I'm not, this isn't for you, but this is when I talk to people out there, when I say like, tell me about this abstract thing that you just made up that's supposed to serve as the parity argument for morality, give me more details about it. It's just all that happens is gibberish, and so we can't really assess. So you claim that you can just make up any abstract object and claim it exists, and you can't rule it out as the kind of thing that couldn't possibly exist. That's the claim. I could make up any abstract object, and you can't show me that it couldn't possibly exist. But I'm claiming, yes, I could. If you describe more of it to me, then I could show you why it couldn't possibly exist. If blurple is a piece of paper that exists in all possible worlds, I can tell you right now why that couldn't exist. That's because there are some worlds in which there are no physical objects at all, and paper is a physical object. There couldn't be a necessarily existing piece of paper. So when you say blurple and what you mean is a necessarily existing piece of paper, I can tell you why that couldn't possibly exist. And so on, I claim that any other sort of putative abstract object you think you can just make up, I can pull those same kinds of moves, show you why they couldn't possibly exist in all possible worlds because of the nature of the thing as you've described it.
Well, how can I just like any abstract object could exist as long as it's not self-contradictory, right? And so there could be an abstract object, an abstract pizza. We just don't understand yet.
Well, so the reason there couldn't be an abstract pizza is, I mean, this is the same move. So a pizza is, pizzas are made of what? Bread, sauce. They have certain conditions that make something a pizza. They're the kinds of things, they're physical objects because the kinds of ingredients that they have are physical objects. Are there worlds in which there are no physical objects at all? Yes. That's why you couldn't have a necessarily existing pizza.
Well, pizzas can be abstract objects. There's an abstract space, which kind of works like space-time, and it creates pizza. So there's an abstract pizza.
Yeah, when you say pizzas could be an abstract object, that's like saying there could be round squares. What I said, round square. You don't think I? No, there's an incoherence in the very notion of a round square. Once you understand what it is to be round and what it is to be square, you know that those two can't exist at the same time. Once you know what it is to be a pizza, and once you know what necessary existent means, then you can see those can't possibly exist because pizzas are physical things, and there could be a world without physical things. So a pizza couldn't exist in that world. So pizzas aren't necessarily existing.
Well, that's false.
There could be necessarily existing pizza doesn't mean it's true that there could be a necessarily existing
so there could be other ontologies other than the physical realm. There could be a supernatural world, and the supernatural world can have supernatural pizzas, and there could be an ubernatural world, and the ubernatural world can have ubernatural pizzas, and they don't have space-time. So there's non-spatial time pizzas. They still exist, and they can exist in all possible worlds. There can be an abstract concept of pizza that exists in all possible worlds. And it doesn't need to be physical at all. Just our version in this world is physical, and we call it a pizza, but there's some essence, some abstract essence of pizzaness in there that is actually shared in all possible worlds. So there could be an abstract pizzaness thing.
Of course, you can use the word pizza and attach it to an abstract object. I don't deny that. I do deny that there could be a thing that is a pizza and exists in all possible worlds, because pizzas, by their nature, if we even know what pizzas are, they're physical objects. You say, no, but it's a non-physical pizza. And now what I'm going to say is you've basically just said it's a round square. And then I'll say, yeah, those are contradictory properties. You can't be a pizza and non-physical at the same time.
I'm arguing more like there's an essence of pizza. So we make these things called pizza, and we use the word pizza for them, but they have an essence, an abstract essence in their nature.
Form of pizza.
What?
You're saying like the form of pizza.
Sort of, yeah. So like a form of pizza.
That's great. The form of pizza is not a pizza.
Sure. So we can say the form of pizza. The form of pizza. There's an abstract form of pizza that applies to supernatural worlds and physical worlds and non-physical worlds. It is the abstract pizza-ness property.
I see. Yeah. The form of pizza could exist. Yeah, I'm sort of agnostic about whether the form of pizza exists. It's really just a question of whether it's coherent or incoherent. If it's coherent, I'm perfectly happy to say there's a form of pizza. And, there's a form of basically everything that exists. That is, but, in general, I just think that maybe pizzas don't have essences. And so that explains why there's no form of pizza.
Yes.
Because there is no thing that unifies all of pizza-ness or something like that. But again, I've given you an explanation for why you can't just pick a thing and say that it exists necessarily, it's because once you look into the details of the properties, you'll see that it doesn't work. And if pizzas don't have essences, there's no form of pizza.
Right. So that's the same thing on applied to morality. We can just pick any object or any idea, say it has a magical essence that applies to all possible worlds, and you can say, no, it doesn't. That's silly. We're just making stuff up. I don't think there's any objective thing there at all. And it seems like the same argument applies to morality. We're just labeling something we see as having this magical essence that applies in all possible worlds. And we could label anything. Mountains, say there's a magical mountainness, there's a mountainness thing, or a pizza-ness thing. All of the different counters to the ontological argument, just change it from the object itself to an essence of the object, and you get the exact same counter.
Of course, you could say that morality has no essence, and that explains why it couldn't possibly exist. But that's just saying words. What's the argument that morality couldn't possibly have an essence, or there's no essence, there's no like thing that it is to be a moral truth or something? What's the story about that? You can't just say it.
Oh, I'd say it's the same as there's a essence of pizza. It's just something we've made up. It seems like there's no substantive difference between saying a pizza has an essence in all possible worlds, or a mountain has an essence in all possible worlds, and morality has an essence in all possible worlds. And so simply asserting that it's possible that something has some essence in all possible worlds is not a justification to believe it does.
Yeah, it sounded like you said, well, we just made it up. I could say, you said this, I could say we just made it up. Yeah, you could say that, but the question is, what justification do you have for saying that? What makes you think that we just made it up? And that's literally all there is. That's not an argument for anti-realism. That's an assertion of anti-realism.
Right. So I can argue that I can make up a lot of things that I claim essences that I don't actually think have essences. Pizzas, I don't think pizza has an essence. I don't think mountains have an essence. I don't think unicorns have an essence. But I can assert any of these things as having essences, because the ability to assert things as having essences is a very easy thing we have in our brains. And so we could do this to anything: false things, true things, right things, wrong things, blue things. We can assert it about anything, and they can all be possible. But it seems like the fact that you can do this does not justify the belief in that thing being true, that it has an essence. And that seems to be the only thing you've done for morality, is do the exact same methodology. You've asserted it has this possibility, just like I've asserted the pizza does, and I don't see any substantive difference between the two, or any of the infinitely many other things we can assert have essences. Therefore, we should believe that it's not a real thing, or the argument is unjustified.
Yeah. So the way to show that something doesn't have an essence is to show that there's something contradictory about it, that it couldn't possibly be the way that it's claimed to be, or something like that.
Well, doesn't that lead to the, one sec, just to clarify, doesn't that lead to the conclusion that anything that doesn't have a contradiction could be argued to have an essence equally?
It could be an abstract object if it's, but that doesn't leave very many things at all. So basically every physical object is going to be the kind of thing that couldn't exist in every possible world. So it's not going to be the kind of thing that could serve as like a parody for morality or something like that, because there's worlds in which there aren't physical objects. So there's no physical object that exists necessarily. So the question is like, you seem to think like that's going to leave us open to tons of things, but I'm saying, well, it rules out all the physical things. So that what other things are you left with? Well, it looks like all you're left with is abstract objects. And for those, I'm happy to say, yeah, I mean, if they possibly exist, and they're the kinds of things that if they exist necessarily, then they exist. So numbers, propositions, possibilities, I'm happy to let all that stuff in. But I don't have to let in pizzas or mountains or goofy things that people try to use as a parody argument against ontological arguments.
Well, so I'm trying to say that the scope of possible abstract things is much larger than math and logic and the things that we accept. So there are some things I accept that could be considered abstract, and there are an infinite number of other things that could be abstract that we don't know about. Like there could be an abstract essence of pizza, or an abstract essence of mountain. There could be infinitely many other abstract things that we can assert existing, and it seems like morality could be one of those in that category of other abstract things we're just asserting.
Yeah, so you seem to think that's bad for morality. I mean, if the notion of the essence of a pizza is possible or is not self-contradictory, then I'm happy to say there's an essence of pizza. That is, there's a thing that explains why all the pizzas are what they are. It's because they all share in the essence of pizza. That's just called an abstract object. That's just sort of a function of metaphysical realism, which is like a big debate between the realist and the nominalist. So if what you're saying is, but that would mean that realism is true, that is that there are abstract objects, then I'd say, yeah, I mean, that's right. So there could be, if the notion of a pizza is an abstract object, pizza, or the form of pizza is coherent, I'm happy to say, yeah, it's in there.
So the reason this seems to work as an argument against realism is that because we can assert essentially anything we can come up with to be an abstract object, then it could be in there. But I don't think.
But I haven't seen some. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
That's fine. So, but I don't think we have like. I would tend to believe that just the fact that we can make something up doesn't mean. I don't think there is something that makes a pizza in all possible worlds. I think it's something we've made up. And so, of the class of things that we can assert are abstract objects or have some abstract essence, a large portion of that don't exist, probably. And probabilistically, anyone who makes this argument is going to land in that they probably don't exist category for anything that we assert. So if we assert morality has this abstractness property that exists in all possible worlds, the probability that it does seems to be equivalent to the probability pizza does, which is very, very low. Now, it's possible everything does, sure, but if I would tend to think that it's a low possibility of all the different imaginary essences we can come up with that they actually do. Therefore, prima facie, we can think that if you assert something via the ontological argument existing as this abstract universal, it's probably false.
Good. So you claim that we could just make up lots of really goofy abstract objects. So I ask which ones. One is the form of pizza. In a second, I'll try to show why, if there is such a thing, it's not as weird as it sounds. But then you say, well, we could just come up with all kinds of other crazy stuff too. And I would just like to hear how that goes. That's sort of a promissory note. We could do it, but I'd be interested to hear how you do it, because I have a general strategy to show either that's not possible at all, or if it is possible, then it's not that weird. Let's take the form of pizza. If it exists, then it's not like some weird like pizza that's hanging out there. All it is an abstract object. It's the thing in virtue of which other pizzas are correctly called pizzas. And it's just, it probably specifies that, anything that's a pizza has to be, I almost said circular, but there are pizzas that are non-circular, has to have cheese and maybe sauce and maybe bread or something like that. It's something like that. It's not like, some like a ghost pizza up there that has pepperonis on it or something.
Right.
You don't have to believe it's not going to be a weird thing like that. It's just going to be like the number 2,
Yeah. Like there's
the number
existing,
2 isn't like,
there's an existing abstract principle that makes pizzas. That's obviously, I don't think there is such a thing. It seems like something we've just made up, that there is this existing abstract principle of the pizza principle that makes pizzas. And I don't see the difference between that and morality.
Yeah, I just want to say, I haven't here committed myself to the existence of the form of pizza. I really think it's just a matter of whether or not there is a thing in virtue of which all pizzas are pizzas, and I don't know the answer to that. So I don't have views about the metaphysics of pizzas. I'm just saying, if there were, it wouldn't be as crazy as you think. I'm sort of agnostic about whether, nothing here depends on there, actually being a form of pizza. I don't know. Yeah, that's all. I just want to say abstract objects are less weird than many people claim. They're not like ghost pizzas and ghost mountains and ghost gold bars and stuff like that. They're something else.
Right. I don't think, the point of the counter ontological arguments isn't whether they're actual mountains, but if you take it as the essence argument, say, I don't think there's a reason to believe there's an essence of a pizza. Is it possible? Sure. That it's possible there is this abstract principle that makes pizzas. Yeah. It's possible there isn't. It's possible there is no such thing and we've just made it up.
Yeah. And that same thing is true with morality.
Yeah.
So it's possible we just made morality up. I want to say it's that claim is true if the possibility is understood epistemically. That is, like, we can't rule out that we just made morality up and it's all fake. That's true. In terms of when it comes to the epistemic possibility that morality is just a bunch of junk, absolutely, we cannot rule that out. But I want to claim that we can judge that it's less probable than probable. That is, it's more likely false that we just made it up than that we didn't. And the ontological argument is supposed to be doing that, to try to convince you, because the possibility premise is more likely true than false. And the reason it's more likely true than false is because it's a coherent thing. We have some pre-theoretical grip on what it would be for there to be stance-independent truths, that it's the kind of thing you ought to do even if you don't want to. It's when you should save a kid from drowning, even if you don't want to get your suit dirty. Well, we understand that, like, people claim you should still do it. That's what a stance-independent.
One second. So, because the reason I brought up the pizza was to counter the ontological argument, because we could use the ontological argument for any of these hypothetical abstract things, abstract pizza, abstract morality, and so the ontological argument on its own does not seem to give us any more justification for the pizza than morality. And sure, they're both possible, but I don't think the ontological argument provides any reason to think it's more probable.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just point out where our disagreement lies. It's just this. I claim that if there is a form of pizza, it's not problematic. It's just totally, it's just like.
I just clarify. I'm not saying it's problematic. I'm saying, does the ontological argument give us reason to believe in morality? No more so than it gives us reason to believe in pizza.
Yeah, because it's about abstract objects, and this pizza that you're considering is an abstract object. So if there are things that could possibly exist, and if they exist in all possible worlds, then they exist in reality. That's going to be true of morality. That's going to be true of numbers, of possibilities, of propositions, of every abstract object, including the form of pizza. Yeah. But you seem to think, well, that's just absurd. That's the way the parity argument works. That's absurd. No, it's no more absurd than abstract objects. I mean, there's a big debate in between realists and nominalists in metaphysics about whether or not abstract objects exist. This is just saying, it's just sort of entering into that debate and saying, yeah, morality would be one of those things as well.
Right. So I would say that, to me, the crux of the argument is that there seems to be a difference in believing some abstract objects as opposed to others. Like if you're granting that the ontological argument would give equal weights to the pizza and morality, to me that does seem absurd, because I think the pizza is absurd. The abstract pizza is just something we've asserted. Like, no one would accept there's an abstract pizza just because of the ontological argument.
Yeah. But remember, I'm not committed to there actually being maybe there is, maybe there isn't. If the notion of the form of pizza is incoherent in some way, and I haven't investigated the nature of pizzas enough to say, then that's not a problem. There is no form of pizza because it's incoherent. But if, however, it's coherent, then I'm happy to say that it exists in the way that Fahrenheit 451 exists, in the sense that there's like a form that it has certain words. And not just in book form. Like, even if we destroyed all the copies of Fahrenheit 451, if somebody remembers it in their head, it still exists. They could still write it out. Okay. So maybe we just disagree about the nature of abstract objects, because you're saying the pizza's crazy, but I wasn't committed to the pizza. I was committed to the abstract objects.
Well, I'm not sure why you being committed is relevant. I don't care if you're committed one way or the other. My question is, if we accept the ontological argument as a reasonable justification to believe something, it seems like we can use the same argument for any essence we could potentially make up that doesn't have an incoherency, like essence of pizza, essence of mountain, essence of Fahrenheit 411, whatever. Yeah. So that argument works for just literally anything we can say has an essence, right?
Yeah.
And if you agree with that, that's fine. That's just, to me, that intuitively seems like a problem. And if it's not, I'm fine. You don't need to be committed to that. It just, to me, that seems bad, like a bad method.
Yeah, I think our disagreement is about how bad how many things we think will let in with that. So you think that's going to let in a ton of stuff into our ontology, and I think no. Once you look into the conditions of the things that you're investigating, it's going to not leave very much at all, and that's because it's pretty easy to go incoherent. Like everybody thinks a necessarily existing mountain. When they hear that, they think, oh yeah, definitely there could be one of those. But once I point out, no, a mountain is a physical thing, and it could be the case that there's a world with no physical stuff at all. So there couldn't possibly be a necessarily existing mountain. I think because people think that if you can describe something, it's got to be possible. That gives them the sense that this test is going to let way too much into our ontology. I claim it's not going to let nearly as much as you think in. Think about exactly what it would be to have the form of whatever. And if it's incoherent, then it's in bad shape. And if it's coherent, that's not going to be much stuff, but then it's in.
Yeah, it seems like because mountains are contingent on space-time fields, and so you need space-time fields to have mountains, you can say it couldn't exist in all possible worlds because it's possible to not have this field. But I don't know, couldn't you say the same thing about abstract objects? Maybe abstract objects are contingent on an abstract field, and if there's no field, there's no abstract objects.
The nature, so you could say that, but abstract objects, at least typically conceived, don't depend on fields because they could exist even if there weren't fields. So they don't depend on fields. Now you say they depend on abstract object fields, but it's unclear if that refers to anything. So, of course you just made it up. And I know that, but if you could deliver more content to what is an abstract object field, then we could get a sense of whether or not such a thing could possibly exist. But this is sort of my point, which is like you can't just say incoherent, you can't just like make up words, blorfians or whatever, blorple. You have to fill in the details before we can assess whether that really is an absurdity for the view that I've described here, or whether you just made up words.
Well, so what I'm thinking here is that before we knew of fields, before we knew of that matter makes mountains or whatever, if we think tens of thousands of years ago, we didn't know much about reality. And so if you asked, why couldn't a mountain be an abstract object? You couldn't reply because it's physical. We don't know it. We just don't know enough about mountains. And so it seems to me the same thing applies here. It's simply the ignorance of we don't know enough about what it is that allows us to say whether or not it qualifies as an abstract object or whether we can say it is. And you can only say it is if we don't know anything about it. And so it's kind of like an argument from ignorance of you can only say things that are abstract if we don't know anything about it. And you start adding things we know about it, well, it doesn't count anymore.
Well, I think that stance-independent moral truths could exist, and I think we do know something about it. So I think that by adding, content to what we're talking about, we don't like eliminate the possibility of the thing.
What do we know about it? Like, how would you, if I asked what are the things we know about them? How would you answer that?
Yeah, what do we know about stance-independent truths?
Yeah.
About moral truths? Yeah, they're the kinds of things that tell you what you ought to do, regardless of what your attitudes are. Standard examples. So let me point to the example that might be helpful. I mean, standard examples are, a kid is drowning in a pool and you don't want to save him, but a lot of people think you should save him, even if you have no interest that would be furthered by saving this kid. If it costs virtually nothing to you, you should save him, even if you don't want to. You would, in other words, you would be justified in saving them. These are considerations that justify your saving them, that make it make sense to save him. That's the kind of things that stance-independent moral truths do. They make certain courses of action make sense or make it justified.
Okay, so what if I said,
why you should do this?
Why would that be a moral truth rather than you should grow potatoes on Wednesday?
Well, I mean, you're going to have to look into the content of the moral theory. I mean, the moral theory is going to tell you what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. So if, for instance, utilitarianism is true, why should you save a kid rather than do something to a potato? The answer is because one will save a kid's life, which brings about tons of well-being, and the other one does virtually nothing in terms of well-being. But the general answer to your question, why is this a moral truth rather than that, is going to appeal to whatever the true moral theory is. It's going to appeal to first order considerations about what matters and what doesn't matter. And that's what is specified by the field.
Like, could the moral truth or the moral theory be different sufficiently that we wouldn't be able to call it morality anymore? Let's say like grow potatoes or something. Like, so we pick some, say there is moral realism, but what it says is has nothing to do with anything we feel about morality. It says pick your nose on a Wednesday or something, like some ridiculous thing. Would we still be able to call that morality?
Yeah. So this is actually the subject of some debate. You might think some people think there are conceptual constraints on morality. So one thing morality couldn't say is just everybody should go stabbing themselves in the eyes all day long and causing themselves enormous suffering. And the reason it couldn't is because morality is supposed to be about how to live well together, or how to live a good life, or how to help each other flourish, or how to help yourself flourish. So if there's something that would obviously make your life go terribly, then that just couldn't possibly be one of the moral truths. But I mean, what I tend to say is this, basically your question is, could we be in an evil demon scenario with respect to morality? So just like you could be in an evil demon scenario with respect to your empirical beliefs about what the world is like, is it possible that all our empirical beliefs are false? Absolutely. We could be deceived by an evil demon. And by possibility, I just mean epistemic possibility. For all we know, we're being deceived by an evil demon. Could the same thing be true of morality? Probably, yeah. I mean, I guess it's possible that an evil demon is feeding us false moral beliefs, but that doesn't discredit morality any more than it discredits our empirical beliefs. So yeah, I mean, in one sense, for all we know, it's, we could be deceived, and the true moral theory could be maybe, I don't know, throw grenades at your family or something. I don't know.
Okay, and so because the ontological argument could work for both the potato morality or the evil demon morality and the regular morality, is there a way to, doesn't that indicate that it doesn't indicate morality at all? Why would that still work for morality if it could work for potato morality and real morality?
Yeah, because the ontological argument doesn't depend on the content of the moral theory at all. So it just says, so just go back to the actual argument, and this is what it says. If it's metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths, then there actually are stance-independent moral truths. And it's metaphysically possible that there are stance-independent moral truths, so there are. Okay, so it doesn't depend on anything about the content of the moral theory. So something about but it could be that, doing stuff to potatoes is the right moral. That just doesn't touch the ontological argument as I've described it here. It's just sort of, it says, I mean, yeah, maybe, but the point is just that it's possible that there are some stance-independent moral truths.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how the ontological argument gives more weight to simply saying there is something than there is not something, because that seems to be circular, very circular, to say that the possibility of something is more likely than it not existing, simply because it's coherent.
Yeah, well, the justification was we already have pre-theoretical reason to think that these things exist. So that's a first start. Like, it's not as like we come
the
to
intuitions,
theorizing about
the intuitions, is that the pre-theoretic thing you're mentioning?
Yeah. So most people, before they ever come to philosophy, think that there's stuff that they ought to do. And if you push them, now they wouldn't say, I believe in stance independent moral truth. They would never say that. But if you ask them, you think you ought to, not murder people. Is it because your family would be upset with you? Is that the only reason? And they would say, no. Is it because your culture would condemn you? Is that the only reason? Most people say no. So when you go through all the different stances, they would say that doesn't depend on that. So that's why, pre-theoretically, a lot of people, I'm not claiming everybody, but a lot of people think that there are things you ought to do independent of what your desires are. And so they come with that. Okay, so it's not as though like I just made this up out of nowhere. We already thought these things existed. We already thought we were coming to know them by means of philosophical reflection. And now we just want to know if they're possible. And I claimed they are possible because there's nothing incoherent about them. All the arguments that there are no moral truths at best show that they probably don't exist. But once you add to the evidence pool the ontological argument, which just appeals to the mere possibility, now you have excellent reason to think that they do exist. So that was all to say, how can the mere possibility of this thing be more likely true than false? It's because we already have reason to think they exist. They're perfectly coherent. They're the kinds of things that would make sense of our world, and so of our moral experience. They would make sense of why we think that it's morally wrong to do all kinds of things. So it looks like, all things considered, it's more likely true that moral truths are possible than that it's false. It's not guaranteed, but this is the best you can do in philosophy.
That's strange. It seems like the ontological argument doesn't do any work there. It just says that we already have these I forget what the word to use, the intuitions, and then the ontological argument means that we can take any of those intuitions we have and think it applies universally, essentially. That seems like the only work that the ontological argument does.
It's just a vindication of the possibility premise. That's what the intuitions are doing. It's just saying, is there it's just saying, why would we ever think that there could be stance independent moral truths? And I'm saying, well, we already thought there was. We have this experience as if there are such things. So it's not like we just pulled it out of our butt. It's not like one day somebody just wrote an article about this weird thing they wanted to describe. We already thought it was there, and now we want to know if it really is there. Is it really? Are there really stance independent moral truths? Well, it does seem that they're possible. Just on reflection, it seems that they're possible. Now, just because I reflect on something and it seems possible doesn't guarantee that it is. But let's look for other reasons to think that there aren't stance independent moral truths. I mean, this is just doing standard philosophy. It doesn't look like there are any other reasons that rule out the possibility. And that's supposed to be the justification for the possibility premise. It's sort of going through all these steps to try to think what on earth could eliminate the possibility of a stance independent moral truth. And it doesn't look like there's anything that could.
Awesome. All right. We got some questions from the audience I wanted to go through real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Sully Q asks, why shouldn't we think normativity is just a product of our brains?
Well, I mean, so normativity is about what you should do, right? So it's true. I mean, if the point is it's hard to even know what this question is asking. Why shouldn't you think normativity is just a part of your brain? Like your brain, like you use your brain to come to conclusions about morality. That's true.
I think the question is why not think normativity is like unicorns, something just our brain made up and doesn't exist objectively in the universe at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you theorize about morality, when you think about like what's right and wrong, I take it that many people have the experience that it does seem unjustified to set somebody on fire just because of the reading light it provides. When they think about whether or not there's a good reason to do it, it doesn't look like there is. When they think about any stances that it might depend on, it doesn't look like there are any. And now we need to know, but am I just merely deceived? And now think about like, okay, well, what could be deceiving me? Maybe it's evolution, but I'm able to step past the evolutionary inclinations that evolution gives me all the time. I'm able to do that. So why wouldn't I be able to do that in the case of morality? It doesn't seem like there's any reason to think that I'm especially deluded by evolution in the case of morality, but not any other one. So it looks like all the defeaters that you can hear, there are reasons to think that you can get past those defeaters so that you're not endlessly deluded by morality. So, by evolution. So that's the reason to think like, is it possible that you're deluded? Absolutely it is. But that's the nature. I mean, that's the truth for philosophy in general. But that's the general story about why you should think and the ontological argument as well. I mean, these sorts of positive arguments are supposed to be reasons to think that the stuff exists and that it's not merely a product of your own, mind.
All right, Marty Man Scientist, thank you for the super chat. Eric, how is moral realism coherent in a deterministic universe if it's not like made of physical stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, the determinism just says that once you fix the initial conditions and the laws of nature, there's only one way the world could go. It doesn't entail that there are no truth. I mean, nothing about determinism makes it the case that there are no truths about how you ought to act. And so, I guess I would just say that these theses are sort of talking past one another, or not talking about. They're just not even. They're not in conflict at all. That nothing about determinism suggests that there couldn't be moral truths. But maybe you want to say more, Tom.
Yeah, I think it's a reference to more the theistic debates of if there's no free will, how can anything be moral? Because if you're not culpable for your free choices, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to say is you still could go around doing wrong things. It's just you have no choice about it. That's one thing to say. I don't think that's right. A lot of people are compatibilists. That is, they think that you can have moral responsibility and you can act freely even if you're determined to do things. I tend to go libertarian. I mean, I'm sort of agnostic about free will stuff, but I tend to go libertarian. So I would think that it would be very bad if determinism was true, because it would mean that we're more or less condemned to do bad stuff. But even if you're condemned to do bad stuff, it's not the case that it ceases to be bad stuff.
All right. Second question from Marty. Ask him about moral decisions based on limited information. If a moral judgment changes with information, then there is always more moral decisions.
It's true that in general, you want to get as much information as you can, because what you ought to do depends on what the facts are. So whether you ought to kill this person depends on whether they're trying to kill you or whether they're trying to save you. But I mean, yeah. But it's perfectly consistent with realism that you got to continually try to acquire facts about your relevant situation, because on realism, the truth about what you ought to do is independent of your attitudes. That means you got to go searching beyond just what your attitudes are in order to figure out what to do. If the moral truths depended only on what your attitudes are, you wouldn't need to go into the world and figure out the way things are much. For the most part, you would just need to look inward and see what do I desire? What do I care about? So right. At least on realism, it makes perfect sense to go collecting information.
All right, Briley, thank you for the super chat. TJump, could you ask him what is the specific justification for stance-independent truths other than they aren't incoherent?
Yeah, well, so if you're doing philosophy, suppose I suspect that there are people out there who are hearing this and they're like, I don't think realism is true. It doesn't seem right to me. So when you consider the arguments for realism, I take it that many people are like, I don't think that's right. I submit to you that what you're doing is consulting your philosophical intuition. You're judging the strength or weakness of arguments on the basis of how it intellectually seems to you. That means you're using your intuition. So what do I use when I try to figure out the moral truths? I use the same thing I use when I do philosophy in general, and I use the same thing that you, anti-realists and error theorists, use as well. You use your philosophical intuition when you judge, whether or not this thing or that is the best explanation for something. You don't have a best explanation counter or a best explanation device that goes around finding. You consult your intuition. That is your philosophical intuition. You see what strikes you as plausible and implausible. You think about alternative explanations and you think about which one is best. The whole time you're using your intuition. So what's the justification for thinking there stands independent moral truths, independent of our attitudes? It's that it seems intuitively correct. And when people consult their intuition about whether they ought to do this, it seems that they should. And when they consult about whether or not it depends on some stance that you ought to do this thing, it seems that it doesn't depend on any particular stance. In other words, the justification is intuition. And if you say, oh, that's bullcrap, I submit to you, you use your intuition as well. Use your intuition to judge whether or not you think realism is plausible. You should admit that and admit that intuition is a good source of philosophical knowledge, and just play the game that the rest of us are playing, which is using our intuitions to come to the truth about all of philosophy, including metaethics.
And they asked to follow up, if the answer is intuition, how does it make stance-independent truths more probable than we just made it up?
Well, because if intuition justifies you in believing certain things, and you're justified in believing that you ought to do things independent of your attitudes, and you get to that just by considering cases and whether it depends on somebody's attitudes, then that justifies you in believing that you ought to do things independent of your attitudes. Once you get intuition as a justification, then if it provides you justification, then it makes it more probable than not that you ought to do as intuition suggests that you ought to do.
All right. Then Farida D, how can morality be objective without a God?
Well, I mean, one question is how could it be objective with a God? I mean, what sort of thing does God do that would sort of inject the objectivity into the moral domain? That's one question. How could it be objective if there is no God? Well, I don't know. How could there? I mean, basic answer is this: how could there be numbers if there is no God, or how could there be possibilities if there is no God? There could be these truths about what the world is like, about what reality is like, including about what normative reality is like, and it doesn't look like they depend on a God.
All right.
I don't know if that probably doesn't answer their question, but you know.
I'm not a theist, so I think it's fine.
Okay, yeah.
But Sully asks, I have the intuition morality is subjective. Isn't that equally as justified as yours that it's objective?
Yeah, I do think, yeah, so intuition is definitely justification for the person who has the intuition. So if when you consider many of these cases, you think, oh no, it doesn't, it seems like what's wrong about morality, or sorry, what's wrong about killing someone without justification is just that I don't like it, or somebody else doesn't like it, or something like that. Then yeah, I mean, if you genuinely have that intuition, then yes, then you are justified prima facie in believing that. That's the nature of intuition, of philosophical intuitions in general. If it intellectually seems to you that P, then you're justified in believing P. That's the nature of it. Yeah.
And you would then posit the other reasons, like the ontological argument, to prioritize realism over subjectivism?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I would say is, well, at least it seems to me when I consider many of these cases that it's wrong, independent of my attitudes, to do this bad stuff. And I should just submit to you that other people report that it seems to them, even anti-realists, even error theorists report that intuitively it does seem to them that they ought to, that there are stance independent moral reasons, but then they just sort of have other arguments that suggest that they're deluded in one way or another. That's all to say that I think a lot of people, when they report that they don't have these intuitions, are maybe at least some of them, maybe not all, but at least some of them are either misreporting what they're experiencing, or I wouldn't say lying, but they're misreporting what they're experiencing because they don't like realism for whatever reason. But all of that is to say, yeah, I mean, this is philosophy in general. There are disagreements and intuitions about lots of different cases. What do you do in those cases? Well, you keep offering arguments and you keep considering what the implications of the various views are and whether those are intuitively plausible or intuitively implausible, and you just keep doing philosophy.
All right. Coffee Smug asks, by virtue of what are moral facts categorically binding? Reason to do P even if I don't want to.
By virtue of what? I mean, by virtue of, this is going to be totally unsatisfying, by virtue of the very nature of the thing. So, I mean, there are reasons for action. So stance independent reasons are reasons to do things. So when you ought to save the kid, why should you save the kid? Well, because his suffering is going to be enormous, and the suffering of his parents is going to be enormous if he dies. And it wouldn't be that problematic for you to get your suit messy. So that's what the reason is. And now, in virtue of what is it stance independent? Well, because it doesn't depend on anyone's attitudes, that you ought to do that. And then what was the rest of the question? Or how did it go?
He was just giving an example. A reason to do P even if I don't want to. So he's just like,
even if I don't want to.
Yeah, so this is binding that I do P even if I don't want to. So I was just rephrasing the question.
Why is it binding? Yeah. Because even if you don't care about the kid's suffering, it still matters, even if you don't care about it. That's just the nature of his suffering, and it's mattering. Mattering on the stance independent view just doesn't depend on your attitudes. Even if you don't like it, maybe you won't help the kid. That's fine. Realism says you should have, even if you didn't want to.
All right. What is your view on what is the correct moral realism position?
Yeah, like which ethical theory is correct?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sort of agnostic about which of the many ethical theories are correct. I think that's perfectly consistent with realism. It's sort of like saying, just like realism in science, like what's the true chemical theory? I don't know. We'll figure it out eventually. But it's still the case that I think that there's a truth about the chemistry independent of our attitudes. And it's not, the point of science isn't merely to make predictions. So that was just to say, so in the past when I've said, like, I'm not sure which normative ethical theory is correct, a lot of people said, oh my gosh, this guy, what is he? He's a realist. I don't need to be committed to a first order theory in order to defend the meta-ethical theory that is that there's a truth independent of our attitudes. But I'm more inclined to virtue ethics than probably any theory. I'm also inclined towards David Ross's he's a kind of intuitionism, or it's he has the ethics of prima facie duties. I'm sort of agnostic between those two.
All right. What do you think of my version? What I think the objective moral principle is that any involuntary imposition of consent is immoral. So the best moral world would be one where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing, essentially.
Yeah, on hearing it, I mean, I would just think that there are going to be disaster cases in which you ought to force somebody to do things against their will. I'm sure you've heard this before. I mean, I don't have any sort of deep insight against this particular thing. So the idea is it's morally wrong it's morally wrong to force somebody to do something they don't consent to or something. What is it? Say
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in my world, it would be slightly different. I'd say it would be physically impossible because to make the perfect moral world, it would be physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to. Like for you or the universe itself. The universe itself could not physically make you do these things.
Yeah, I guess I would say, look, if I have to torture somebody to save 10,000 people from burning to death, I should torture that person, even though they don't consent to it. I think that's just sort of a data of moral theory, sort of. And this is, I mean, now maybe it would have to be revised upon further theorizing, but in any case, there are going to be cases that seem like as true as anything I can imagine, such that the theory ought to account for that. And I have more confidence in those data points than I do in the general principle. And so I would throw out the general principle. That is it's wrong if you do force somebody to do something against their will. I'm much less confident of that than I am that it's permissible to torture one person to save 10 billion people from burning to death. And so I would say, well, I guess I got to throw out the moral theory because it doesn't comport with this particular thing, which I'm much more confident in.
All right. So like in my perfect world, it would be physically impossible for them to burn to death if they didn't literally choose to. So it wouldn't be the case that it would be moral to sacrifice one person because if they like chose to do it, they're actively saying, I want to do this. So it would probably be immoral to do that. So in that case, don't you think that would be essentially the morally perfect universe?
A world in which they can't burn to death?
Yeah, it's impossible for anyone or any physical state in reality to take place where it's not consensual. Like you can't force anyone. No one can be forced by anything in physics to do anything they don't consent to.
Yeah, I think that may well be the perfect world, maybe. But I guess I would just say that doesn't have any implications for what you ought to do in the world in which you have to torture, unless in the world in which if you don't torture this one person, 10 billion people will burn to death. I'd say no matter what the ideal world is, we want to know about the world in which we're evaluating the behavior. And in that world, I think it's clear that it is permissible to torture this person. So whatever's happening in the ideal world doesn't matter. It doesn't set the standards for what's moral and immoral in this world.
Yep. All right, Mr. E. Arthur. Eric, you asked TJump to provide evidence you are wrong. If your claim is unverifiable, doesn't that put you in a position to never correct yourself? I think that's in reference to the ontological argument where you say you have to provide a coherent alternative or something that if I say morality doesn't exist and you say, well, it's possible, I have the burden of proof to provide some kind of like anti-moral particle or something.
Yeah. That's right. Good. Yeah. So I claim that you have to show me the thing that's supposed to be absurd. And I claim that you didn't show me. And so now this person is asking, Eric, didn't you sort of fail on that principle that you threw at TJump? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think so.
And I guess I wonder where I failed. I don't know if this person can say more. So I offered some arguments. I offered at least 2 arguments. I have another one, which you can find on my website. It's called Morian Arguments Against the Error Theory. It's where I defend Morian arguments, which I think everybody here who's listening is committed to. They just don't know it. So I have another argument. So those are 3 arguments. I take it that was some sort of burden sharing or burden lifting. I don't know. And I've tried to defend realism against lots of challenges. So I don't know. I feel like I did okay.
Roger Winslow, thank you for the super chat. I've learned so much from Tom. Thanks. Appreciate it. Sullivan asks, I very much have the intuition that morality is subjective, as is beauty. Why should that impulse that something is really, really moral and immoral lead us to believe that there are categorical norms?
Yeah, I mean, the question is like, what? So is the idea like, if I have an intuition that there are stance-independent moral truths, why should I believe that there are? Why would that show me that there are? Is that the idea?
I think so. I think that's, yeah, because he's saying that since you're saying that intuitions are a justification, his intuition is that like it's subjective, and why should we prioritize one intuition over the other?
Yeah, why should you prioritize one intuition over the other? I'm not saying so. I'm open to the idea that both realists and anti-realists are rational in holding their views. That is, that neither of them are making an epistemic mistake. Now, it's true that at best one of them is correct, one of them has the truth, but you can be rational in believing something without that thing being true because you could have misleading evidence. So, if you really do have the intuition that it's all subjective, when you reflect on many of these cases, then I think that, I mean, my methodology, and it's not just mine, I mean, I take this to be the methodology of philosophy in general, would justify you in believing that anti realism is true. I don't come here and claim that anybody who's out there right now must convert to realism or they're irrational. I'm just saying that that realism is totally rational. I think it's true. I've tried to explain why I think it's true. And I think intuition is a great way to sort of get at the truth. And by the way, I just to emphasize again, I think everybody out there who's watching is also committed to the idea that intuition helps them get at the truth. So again, let me just mention some things that you definitely use intuition for. When you assess the strength or weakness of arguments, you don't have a detector for strong and weak arguments. You use your intuition. You reflect on the argument and whether or not you think the premises are plausible or implausible, which means you make judgments about the plausibility or implausibility of premises by rational reflection, just by thinking about it and thinking about whether or not that strikes you as true or false. When you make best explanations, many people say the best explanation for this or that is, how did you do the comparison? Do you have a best explanation like machine out there that you use empirically verifying the best explanationness of this explanation over that? No, you use rational reflection. That is, you consider the various hypotheses and you reflect on whether or not they strike you intellectually as plausible or implausible. When you make judgments about probabilities and you don't have empirical evidence to confirm or disconfirm them, you're using your rational intuition. When you have judgments about what hypotheses are ad hoc or undermotivated or just bad explanations, you don't have a bad explanation detector. You instead use your rational reflection. When you think of, sorry, last one. When you think about what the theoretical virtues are and how important they are relative to one another, how important is simplicity, how important is explanatory power, and so on, you're making intuitive judgments about these things. Okay, so all that is to say, everyone here uses their intuition to try to come to philosophical truths. I say do the same thing in philosophy. There's no reason to all of a sudden, in morality, there's no reason to all of a sudden abandon it in morality when you use it everywhere else. Okay, that's all.
All right. Briley, how is this more than just an assertion that morality ought to exist by appealing to how we intuitively feel about what it is?
It is that. I mean, in the sense that I do think that intuition justifies you in at least prima facie until we hear more arguments, and that's why you got to do meta ethics. I don't claim that with any of these arguments it's all settled. I do claim that realism can withstand many of the criticisms, and but you have to go look at the criticisms. But yeah, I'm unapologetic about using intuition for the reasons that I just said. I think we use it all the time. We should be honest about the fact that we use intuition and not claim like, oh well, I never use intuition. That's some some weak and sloppy stuff. No, you use it all the time. So do I, and we should. There's no mistake we're making here.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think intuition is itself a justification, and you need something further. That would probably be the difference. We definitely use intuitions, but I think it's more like a hypothesis builder and not a justification in and of itself. So I would probably disagree that you're justified in believing it just because you have the intuition a priori.
Well, I mean, you may have defeaters, but do you agree that you're prima facie justified? That is, until you get defeaters, you're justified? Or you think it just offers the intellectual appearance as if something is true, just offers no justification at all? Is that the view?
I think that, like, at the point of I think therefore I am, yeah, we're prima facie justified in believing that. But then once we know, oh, there's some difference between my imagination or my experience, I think of a unicorn, I don't see one, that acts as a defeater for any of the next beliefs you have about the world. And so I think that prima facie justified kind of ends at cogito, and then after that, not anymore.
Okay, when you assess the strength or weakness of arguments, how do you do that? Like what sort of confirmation and disconfirmation process do you go through that isn't just assessing by means of rational reflection and your intuition whether the argument is good or bad?
I built a language in order to describe the things I experience called logic, and the things that are good at describing that, I see if it coheres with those and doesn't. That's how I would assess if an argument is true or false.
Yeah, so when you say you run them through logic, I mean, so you test for whether they're valid or invalid, fair enough. But arguments can be valid or invalid, and the premises can be more and less plausible, right? There's more than just validity to arguments. So if all you're assessing is validity, I gave you a valid argument for realism. Why aren't you a realist? Presumably it's because you judge that the premises aren't as plausible as their alternatives or something like that, right?
Right. So like there are other arguments that refer to the experiential world, and some of them work and some of them don't. And so of the ones that work is in a class that I accept, and the ones that don't work is in a class I don't accept. And so the class of argument for intuition is in the class I don't accept because it doesn't seem to work very well.
Intuition doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah. Seems to work very badly, like a lot.
Yeah. Okay. I just invite you to go through like many of your philosophical beliefs and see whether or not you have really subjected them to this method, and then ask yourself, wait, why is that the method? Even if you were like perfectly faithful to the method you just described, you could then ask this question, why is that the method? And whatever principle you're using to assess that method itself, I wonder, where'd you get that? And if the answer is you got it from intuition, that's going to be bad news because the whole thing depends on intuition. But okay, we don't have to fight, all right. About
that. Trevorn Wright asks, what is the starting point for objective morality in this world?
What is the starting point?
Imagine, like, because most people think God is the starting point. So what would be the analogy in what you're describing?
Yeah. In general, realists just say, well, there's not going to be a starting point. That's the first thing. We just deny that there is a starting point. But maybe you're wondering, like, what makes it the case that the moral truths are what they are? It's going to be something like they're the only true. The moral theory that is correct is the only one that could have possibly been correct, or something like that. It's going to be, and I take it that theists say the same thing about God. Why is it that God exists? Well, he couldn't fail to exist. Why does the number 2 exist? It couldn't fail to exist. Why is the possibility of a 7-headed dog? Why does that exist? Or why is it true that there could have been a 7-headed dog? Because it couldn't have failed to be possible that there could have been a 7-headed dog, and so on. So why is this necessary truth the truth that it is? Because it couldn't have failed to have been otherwise.
All right, Coffee Smug asks, can you define what moral reason is more informatively than just counting in favor, ? If you can't, then isn't internalism about reason's more rationally compelling position?
No. So here's the first thing. Can I say more about what a stance independent reason is, or an external reason is?
Yeah.
I mean, the standard thing to say is, what is a reason that isn't just counting in favor of or something like that? It's a consideration that would make sense of a course of behavior, that would make it make sense to act on the basis of some course of behavior. It's a thing that would justify you in acting a certain way. It's a consideration that counts in favor. It's a consideration that makes it a good idea to do this or that. That's a kind of thing that a reason is. So a lot of people, so maybe here's another way to say it. So when you're thinking about beliefs, when is a belief a good thing to have? Typically people think, well, a belief is a good belief if it matches the way reality is, if it's true. So truth is a success condition for belief. So when you value something, when you like want it and you want to go after it and you want to get it, when you value something, what is it that makes it valuable? Well, the success condition for valuing is the thing is independently valuable. That is, it functions for values like the attitude of valuing, like truth functions for belief. Truth is the success condition for belief. Being valuable is the success condition for valuing, the attitude of valuing. Those are all things I could say. Who knows if this person will be satisfied? Yeah.
All right, and last question, Mr. E. Arthur, Eric, can your hypothesis be tested to see if it can make new correct predictions? If it can't, how do you check if your hypothesis is just your imagination or a part of the real world?
Yeah. So you certainly can't empirically verify anything about the normative domain, because we're not talking about the empirical world. We're talking about what you ought to do. Now you might think, well, that just shows that it's garbage. But then again, I would just say you're taking success conditions from science and applying them to something else. And if you say, well, there are no truths independent of science, I guess I would like to say, where did you get that claim? Did science give you that claim? Does science show you that there are only scientific truths? I guarantee you that it does not. Science doesn't show you that all there is scientific truth. So so it doesn't predict anything. It doesn't. You can't verify it empirically. I don't think that suggests anything. It doesn't discredit it, just like it doesn't discredit the error theory that it can't be confirmed empirically. So, okay, but can it be confirmed in other ways? Well, I mean, one way it could be confirmed is if other people roughly agree with the sort of normative claims that you're making. That's at least some prima facie evidence. The testimony of other people is evidence for something. If you deny that, then I just invite you to try to live this throughout this life, never believing what people say when they tell you, always saying, "Oh, that's no justification at all to believe anything." People often say like, "Oh, I never believe something just because somebody told me." Yes, you do, and you couldn't possibly live without it. So the testimony of others is a way to confirm your moral theories. And then, of course, rational reflection. I think that's a way to confirm or disconfirm your moral theories. So you may have some general moral theory that you think is true or moral claim, but if it conflicts with some obvious moral judgment you have about a particular case, then that's a reason to throw away your theory and so on. So these are just some ways to try to confirm your moral theory.
And one last question snuck in. What do you think of Cornell realism from Master Uguay?
It's a kind of naturalism. So Cornell realists are people who think that the moral properties are identical to certain scientific properties, like maybe pleasure or something like that. I'm not a naturalist, and I'm not a big fan of naturalism in general. I mean, the big criticism of naturalism is that even if that's what goodness is, it doesn't explain why we ought to pursue it. The only A lot of people think the only game in town that can explain why you ought to do what's good or you ought to do this or that is some version of non-naturalism, because it's not clear how ought could be a physical property of the world. Maybe goodness could if it's pleasure or something like that, but how could it be the case that ought, what you ought to do, is a physical property? That's at least one reason, very quickly, why I'm not a big fan of Cornell realism. But I don't despise it. I don't think it's stupid or anything like that.
Awesome. We've been going for about 2 hours. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Really enjoyed chatting with you. Do you want to give any shout outs or anything before you go?
No, I had a great time. Sorry if I got worked up. Sometimes I get worked up. It was great. I appreciate your time. I like the channel. So keep going.
Awesome. Thanks again. And I will let you go. I'm going to start the after show. You can just close the screen whenever you're ready.
All right, cool. Thanks.
See you later.
Yep.
All right, guys. After show time in the Discord Discord. Hey, Master Uguay, how's it going?
Oh, hello. I was watching the show. It was very good.
Thank you.
Like, it really was. You had interesting points, and I'm actually a moral realist, and you made me think. And I was very much curious about a lot of things you said, but I was actually more curious about what Eric Sampson was saying at a couple of points.
Yeah, like what?
But all in all, you were very good at all. Like I actually couldn't have answered a couple of those questions.
Thank you, appreciate it.
I actually have a kind of epistemological question regarding your stance on intuition. And epistemology is not my forte. I'm very new to philosophy, all in all. But how do you attack Agrippian trilemma?
The Agrippa's trilemma, that's a epistemic problem. So how would that be a problem for my position?
Oh, it isn't necessarily. It's just about your stance on intuition. For example, you can be a reliabilist, you can be a fallibilist, some forms of fundamentalism, coherentism, things like that, to escape some conclusions of Agrippian trilemma.
Well, I don't think you can escape it, because that's all knowledge has to go to one of those three, either foundationalism, coherentism, or infinite regress. So it's either going to be one of those three is going to necessarily ground all knowledge. I don't think there's a way to escape that.
Oh, well, have you encountered a person on Discord called Verbal Silge Engine, maybe?
I don't think so.
He's a professor of epistemology. I had a long discussion with him about epistemology, and I would be interested in how would you respond to something like this, because he says that people who affirm Agrippian trilemma or the conclusions thereof would be called global skeptics, because that would be denying knowledge. And the argument for them would be something. Let me grab it real quick for global skepticism. Just a second. It's a long post that he and I had a while back. Regress argument, that's not it. Oh, for global skepticism. This is, where do I post this? This is an argument he put
After show
forward.
chat is the one there. But so the first thing I would say is that affirming the Grippus limit doesn't mean you don't have knowledge. It only means you don't have certainty about knowledge. So you can grant you still have knowledge even though you don't necessarily have certainty about knowledge. So granting the Grippus limit doesn't necessarily mean you grant global skepticism.
Where would be the after show channel? I can't find it. Oh,
After show chat and social right below general.
Yeah, like this was the argument for global skepticism, and the regress argument is essentially, I can post
so
that as
very
well.
first premise, S knows S if and only if S is absolutely epistemically certain that P, that's false. So you don't need certainty for knowledge. So just reject premise.
Yeah. That's the point. And he's that was something that I was trying to get at. So he would be denying the first premise, which he calls AAC, absolute epistemic certainty, and would be affirming something called APC, absolute psychological certainty, which would be the thesis in fallibilism. But fallibilism, they do not go into regress argument because they do not even fall for it, because it denies absolute epistemic certainty. So the Y regression is falsified or something like that.
Yeah, so like
I can put
just don't require certainty. So anybody who requires certainty, you're going to fall into the trap that Agrippa's trilemma, you're going to fail.
And what seemed to me that Sampson was saying with his arguments from intuition, I think, or maybe not, he's an intuitionalist, mathematical intuitionalist, as opposed to naturalist, is that he would be using the Hume's phenomenological realism, right? And he would be saying that, what I think that he actually stated it: if we have experience of S, we at least have prima facie reason to believe S. And since our intuitions are what validates or something states our experience, it would be a connotational or usable form of justification under that prima facie conditional.
Well, how would that relate? So, like, he's claiming that intuitions are prima facie justified, therefore...
No. He's saying that intuitions are one form of how we reason, how we experience, right? And intuitions are formulated somewhere in between the experience and actual process of knowledge, right? Of acquiring mental states or something like that.
Sure.
And what he would be saying that since it is one of those things, it can be used as the antecedent. So if we have experience or if we have intuition, and we at least have a prima facie justification to claim that our intuitions are correct. So
yes, and
that would be the basis of it. And he would be using this as a sort of intuition to get us to moral intuitionalism. And it would be like saying, since we have experience or intuition that we have this universalizable principle, which grounds all our ethical conversation, I suppose, or our ethical proclamation, language, action, whatever, we at least have prima facie reason to believe moral realism.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he would go into the ontological argument, right? And he would be saying, since we blah, 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 ontological argument, that would be his justification to claim that this is more probable as opposed to less probable.
Yes, I think so. So he's saying that intuitions are trustworthy, more probably in many cases.
Yeah, but I think that you pointed some couple of good counterpoints. I just wanted to clarify if that was a solid understanding of what was transpiring in your conversation.
Yeah, that was definitely the first few parts of the argument.
Mm-hmm. How did you like the conversation? Did it move you in any way? Do you think that you are reconsidering moral realism or something?
Well, I was already a moral realist, so I'm a moral realist, and I think that my version of morality is the best one. So I just don't think, I think his typical justification isn't good. I don't like the intuitions, prima facie, the ontological argument seems to be nothing. So I don't think those justifications are good justifications for moral realism. I don't think that those are things that could be used to actually make the position justified to believe that there is actually morally truth independent or morally subjectively independent truths about morality. So I think that the justifications he provided as the typical ones in a philosophy are pretty weak. I don't think those are good. So it's
how would you oh sorry
go ahead.
How would you go about as you are a moral realist, right? I suspect that you're not a subjectivist, right? That would be an naturalist.
Yep.
So how would you go about stating your moral realism? What would be your defense of it?
I would say that I believe that there are things in the universe that produce moral truths. Like the fact that we have morality is a result of some emergent phenomenon in the universe, and that would apply to all species and all consciousnesses in the universe, not just humans. And that's what makes it objective. So it's not a product of evolution. It's not a product of our societies. It's a product of some combination of emergent phenomenon in the universe that produces morality in all minds everywhere in the universe. And so I think it's an empirical phenomenon. I think it's a law of physics, not an abstract object.
Okay, and you would be saying, I suppose, this is just me rephrasing what I think you're saying. I'm not trying to put words in my mouth. So you have this perfect world in which it is impossible for things to deny your will, right? You cannot, if you want something, you can always do it, or something like that.
That would be the best world. So I'd say that the best possible world would be like that, yes.
Okay, and that state is what you conceptualize as the state in which morality is not subjective. Would that be also fair?
No, I think morality is not objective, and that would be the state in which morality is maximized.
You think that morality is not objective?
No. Morality is objective. It's objective whether or not we get to the best of all possible worlds. But the best of all possible worlds is one where morality has been maximized. It has been, like if we think of the law of gravity, if gravity was maximized, all particles would be crushed together into the smallest state. So if the moral law of physics was maximized, the world would look like the best of all possible worlds, and it would be impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing.
Okay, so in the best possible world, the will of all agents is necessarily maximized.
Sort of, yes.
Or maybe not the will, but the possibility of acting in accordance to one's will. Would that be more fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Would it be possible that there exist multiple such worlds?
Yeah, like depending on the number of people, like for example, if there's a possible world where there's only one person, then that would look different from the possible world if there are two people or three people or whatever. So in different possible worlds, it would look differently based on the number of wills, etc.
Yeah, but let's say that you and I exist. This can be a position here. Like we suppose that you and I.
Just to clarify, the best of all possible worlds mean at no point in time ever did any of these happen. So obviously we're not in the best of all possible worlds, but we could try to get close to it by, in the future, we could get to a point where there are no future impositions, but there'd still be past impositions like Holocaust or whatever. So we'll never be able to get to the best of all possible worlds in our world. The closest we could get would be one where we just maximize the number of future lack of impositions.
Is it possible that our world ever gets to the point of being in the momentary state of perfection?
In the future tense, yes. In the past tense, no. So we will never make this the best of all possible worlds, because the best of all possible worlds had no past impositions either. So the best we could do is just make there no future impositions. So we could have a future best of all possible, but not a total where it fixes all of them.
Yeah, I was just stating a moment in time in the future, some random. Or
no. So the best of all possible worlds has no impositions in the future or in the past. No point in the existence of the world were there ever any. Obviously, we don't have that. But in the future, we can have. There's no more in the future. We can't fix the past ones, but we can fix the future ones, and we can get to that point in our world. Yes.
Okay. So is it possible? This is just me going from understanding, and I'm maybe missing a couple of big blocks here. Would it then be true that the best possible world for your will would be in the state of contest with the best possible world of my will?
No, because in the definition of will in this model, it only applies to yourself and your world. So essentially everybody gets their own universe. You can do whatever you want with it, but your will doesn't apply to anybody else or their universe. It's just the definition of what will means in this context.
What if my will is such that it wants to interact with your universe?
You don't get an option. So your will, the word will, you only have rights over yourself and your universe. You don't get to will anything about anybody else's rights or their universe. It doesn't count as your will because your will only applies to yourself and your universe.
Would it be fair then to say that your best possible world can only exist if your will is such that it doesn't impose on anyone else's will?
You can will to like want to own other people. That's fine, but you can't force them to. They would have to choose to. So it has no effect on your will. It just has effect on the outcomes or achieving of your will. So like if you willed, let's say Hitler had his own world in the BPW. He willed to kill all the Jews or whatever. He could have that will. He could have all those desires, and he could have in his universe, he could kill all the Jews, but there wouldn't be any Jews in his universe unless they chose to go there, because they'd all have their own universes. So he couldn't will anything about anybody else's own universe, even though he willed to do whatever he wanted with his.
Would it be then fair to say that the state of existence in that world would be such that my will cannot be actualized if it is
no, because again,
contrasted
your
or-
will, the moral actualization of your will only applies to yourself and your universe. It does not apply to other people. If you will something about other people, that doesn't apply. So that's totally fine to not get that. It's not immoral because it's their will that you're talking about, not your will. Your will applies to yourself and your universe, and that's it. It doesn't apply to anybody else or their universe.
Let me think for a second, I suppose.
Sorry to interrupt, but I did give a super chat, and my name was Max Foster on the YouTube.
Yes.
And so yeah, that's me.
What was the question again?
So it was in relation to moral realism and drawing a comparison with chess, and
Yes.
you can say that there are moral facts like
Yep, got it. So it's morality is like chess rules, and moral facts can be agreed upon, but only as mind-independent phenomenon. Destiny debate used religious reasoning, faith appeal to best explain. Please address both. Okay, what did you want me to address?
Yeah, so I'll just flesh it out briefly.
Actually,
so,
I have to go to the bathroom really bad. Give me 1 minute.
Okay.
Pee for like an hour.
But did he leave? Oh, he did. Oh, no way. No problem.
See dead people.
All right. I am back. All right, what's the question?
So yeah, it was essentially about moral realism, and then making a comparison with chess, and that you can agree on moral facts, like you can agree on chess moves, and you can make bad and good chess moves. But these are all mind-dependent phenomena, so they don't actually exist in the universe. But that although there are moral facts that can be agreed upon, it's just like the moves of chess.
Yeah, I think that's wrong. But so my moral realism position is that they exist independently of minds. They're true even if there are no minds.
Yeah, but then when you were debating destiny, you kind of the conversation eventually got to a point where you were sort of appealing to the inference to the best explanation, and it was kind of like a bit of a faith-based argument, and people were kind of
well, those
criticizing
are two different things. Inference to the best explanation is abduction. It's one of the three kinds of inference: induction, deduction, abduction. So abduction isn't faith, so you'd have to be more like abduction is perfectly fine. It's what science does in a lot of cases. What do you mean by which part was the faith part?
As in that hold on, as in that
Thank you for the super chat, Frank.
It was that say if you met aliens, that you would draw a comparison with that they would also agree on what the moral facts were, and their morality would be the same.
Well, that's a prediction about the future. That's not faith, because it's prediction.
Yeah, but you're basically, your argument was relying on until you have evidence to the contrary, you're gonna continue with your model of morality.
No, like I think that it's highly likely that this is going to happen. So it's a hypothesis that is explaining the data. I admit there isn't any like strong empirical evidence for it, but I think it's most likely to occur.
Okay, but the belief in God and your belief in morality, what would you say the main difference there is?
I don't claim mine has evidence. They claim theirs has evidence. Mine is just a hypothesis. So if they just said God is a hypothesis, that's perfectly fine. Anybody can make up a God hypothesis. You'd say, so here's you're going to find out when you die. That's the evidence, and then it will be justified after you see it. And like that's fine. Yes. So the position is that here's a hypothesis. I like the hypothesis, and here's the thing in the future you're going to see that'll confirm the hypothesis. So if that's all they were saying, if that's all the theists were saying, then like that would be fine.
Okay, so it's just a hypothesis. But like that's not enough reason to believe that it's true. Like you would also need motivation to believe in the hypothesis, right?
Yep.
And then your evidence for that was that if we met aliens, that they that's
the stuff in the future that if we get it, then it's justified. So that's the thing that if we get that, then it would be justified.
Okay, but like you talked about like progress in history and how it seems to be the case that as we grow and learn more, that we develop our sense of morality, and that's why I think it's kind of like chess, where the more you experiment with chess and morality, the more you understand about how to make good moves in chess, and also the same with morality. And although morality doesn't exist, as a mind independent phenomena, just like chess, it's all mind dependent. But once you agree on what the moral facts are, they do exist, and that is then moral realism.
What? So I don't think it's like chess. Like it's not something humans invented. Clearly evolution would have invented it. Evolution didn't invent chess. So there's definitely a difference between those two.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for clearing that up. Can I join this Discord at like a later date? Is it like always available?
Yeah, it's always it's open to the public. You can join whenever you want.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for talking to me today.
Yep. Anytime. Thanks for the super chat.
All right. Cheers. Bye.
Hey, Udelf Hucow, how's it going? I don't see Amy. Underdog, we can hear your mic still. We can hear your background, whoever's talking.
Oh, sorry. My girlfriend just came home. I'm going off the call. Sorry. She just wanted dinner.
Oh, God. Sorry. Just wanted to make sure you knew that we could hear you talking.
Okay. We're trying. We apologize. I don't use Discord much. How the hell do I get off the call?
Well, you can. There's a phone with a little X under it says voice connected. There's a little X phone next to it. There's also a mute button down there.
Okay, I'll just like switch off my phone. All right, thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Yep. See ya.
All right, cheers, bye.
Okay.
Good.
Anybody else got any questions, comments, or anything?
Someone just said what's good, but I don't know who it was.
No, that was me, but no one answered, so I'm just gonna.
Oh, hey,
What was that a
hey,
question?
yo.
No, that's not a question. I have no idea what's happening or what the stream was about earlier. I just wanted to say hi.
Hey, how's it going? I'm going to try joining the religion section in politics, see what happens.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be there.
Cool.
Seem like
Talking
you,
about
you
myself.
want you.
I was
Yeah,
talking-
I know,
No,
and that's
look,
bad. You shouldn't want
India
these
in
things.
its
They're not
it
gonna- why
doesn't
did you
matter.
change your
The
name?
point about India is that India is not imperialist at all. Like that is partly the reason why India has been able to like sustain like the diversity that it has, and also why Muslims and like Britishers were able to like conquer India even because India is not India doesn't give
No, but to terminate.
I question
No,
my
hold
own
on, Jew, Earth, but
no,
to
but
terminate.
I honestly question my own country. I was like,
stuff. Just, I definitely don't think it was a good way of teaching me. I mean, I can recognize it now. In the moment, it was really hard. I mean, I had no idea. I was like, everybody's going through this. My like best friend, his mom was way worse. He got hit by like a, what do you call that shit? A switch or whatever. Like she would get the curtain thing and then like hit him with that and shit. And I was like, oh, I'm lucky. I don't have to deal with that. And then you find out that there's like better homes and those kids are just like never getting hit and they seem to be always happy and shit in school and being really like well behaved, and I'm just like, what the fuck? It's just like now I can recognize it a lot better.
I'm never having kids. Like I'm never putting them through that. Not even if there's a chance that happening.
What?
Nope. Those conversations suck.
Large server? Yeah.
Need to get
How
my
was
own
your
room in
adventure,
there.
Tom?
oh, you're back.
Yep.
Hey, Tom.
I need to get Doobie to create my own room in there for apologetic stuff. That would be good.
That'd be cool.
Anybody else got anything they want to talk about?
He's a cool guy.
Want to talk about odds?
What?
Odds.
What about them?
The connect. I assume that you would be a naturalist then, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Want to talk about odd problems?
I don't think there are any oughts. I think oughts are things that human psychology places on morality, but morality exists just fine without them.
You mean moral propositions exist fine without them, right?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's the naturalist position.
Yep.
Yeah, but would you say that there is some utility in having oughts functional in society?
Sure, there's utility in that it causes people to do stuff, but that's true of anything that just causes. Money has utility. It is totally fake. So fake things have utility all the time.
Yeah. So would you say that if we could operationalize oughts from the perspective of moral propositions, so that we can connect moral propositions to oughts in a satisfactory manner, that would be beneficial?
Sure.
And you just don't think that that's possible?
I think oughts are subjective. They're hypothetical things humans do. And so it's definitely possible to do that where we apply oughts to morality. If you want to be moral, you ought to do X, Y, and Z, sure. And that it can influence people and be beneficial and benefit society, sure. I don't think it's true, though. I don't think there's like an objective truth statement to that you ought to do moral things. I think it's subjective. If you want to be moral, you ought to do moral things. But it can have utility even if it's not objectively true.
Okay, how about if we could, like, if we can state that moral propositions are true or false, right? And we can somehow connect oughts to moral propositions which are objectively true, would you say that that would make oughts objectively true?
No, that would be a hypothetical imperative. The oughts are still subjectively true, but even if the things they're about are objectively true.
Like, for example, everyone ought to do X. Would that would necessarily be subjective?
Yep.
Even if the moral proposition is objective.
If there was a way, like, I don't think moral propositions have oughts in them. I think like.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's naturalism. I was just saying that if someone could, let's say, somehow, by some magical force or reason it alone, come to that oughts are connected to moral propositions, right? He connects them, like moral propositions are objective, and he states, for example, you ought to do X, and X is objective. Would that statement, that normative statement, ought statement, then be objective? Would you say that's...
Well, no. So if the proposition X is objective and you add you ought to do X, the ought part isn't objective. The ought part is something you've added to it that isn't there. So if the proposition doesn't contain the ought inside of it, then no, the ought wouldn't be objective.
Mm-hmm. How about, this is something that I was thinking about, because I like Cornell realism. It's something that, I don't know, seems most correct to my current state of knowledge of metaethics.
Yep.
And I was thinking about this problem, so I'm curious if you'd like, maybe I can give you something what I was thinking, and you can criticize.
Sure.
Yeah. So I was thinking about making like oughts, like we have a more naturalistic problem, right? That I cannot just jump from descriptive to prescriptive. So what I do is that I state that what an ought is a result of an ought chain. And the ought chain is started from the grounding ought. And the grounding ought is a sort of system one axiom. And it states that we ought to do that which is functionally the best. In your ethical view, that would be we ought to do that which maximizes or brings us closer to, or your function would be something maximizing our ability to not impose will, or do what we want without imposing on will, or something like that. Is this coherent thus far?
Sort of. As long as you don't say that your starting assumption is objective, because it's just your starting assumption. But that seems to be like where you're going, is that your starting assumption that we ought to do whatever is beneficial. That thing itself is objective, which doesn't follow from what you've said.
Okay, yeah, that's far. I think that the thing that I think would make it objective is if we can affirm the grounding axiom as being reasonable to be universally applicable.
Why would that make it objective?
Well, it wouldn't be dependent on the mind. It would be everyone.
Wait. So you said if we determine, based on our mind, if we use our minds to determine that this principle would be reasonable to apply universally, that seems to be, that means that we subjectively feel that this applies, we could or should apply it universally. That seems to be just subjective.
Yeah, that would be, I think that if we can reasonably come to the conclusion that it is reasonable for us to affirm the grounding ought. For example, in mathematics, it is reasonable for us to affirm that one exists.
Well, it's not reasonable for us to infer that one exists. It's reasonable to infer that we can use one to describe existing things. So we could use the principle to describe existing things, but the principle itself doesn't exist objectively.
Could you connect it to math? I'm having a hard time.
Math does not exist. Numbers do not exist. They describe existing things. So math isn't objective. the world which they describe as objective. Like you could say, I'm going to do 1 + 1 = 3 math, and that's fine. Like that's not objectively wrong. It just doesn't describe reality.
So you don't think that the one exists, like what we mean when we say one exists in reality at all?
Well, the number 1 doesn't exist. The abstract objects don't exist anywhere. They're just things, they're languages. 1 is a word that we use to describe things in reality, like the word tree. The word tree does not exist. The tree exists. The things to which the word correspond exist, but the word itself does not actually describe any existing thing.
Okay. Could we say that in the same meaning that we mean when we say that the word tree doesn't exist, it's in our mind, the tree actually exists? Can we say that 1 as a concept exists in our mind, but what we mean when we say 1 exists in the external world, independent of?
What about, does that tie into morality or oughts or whatever?
Well, in the same vein, if we can think of the grounding ought, right, as a meaningful first ought to be affirmed as a system 1 axiom, for example, as math affirms 1 for making it so that we can have ought. Since oughts have utility in our world, they depict our state of language currently, in some sense. Like we use oughts to imply universal standards. We behave as if oughts imply universal standards and similar things. If we can somehow come to a reasonable first starting point of depicting oughts, we have made oughts objective.
So no, never can you ever use the word utility equals objective. It doesn't work. So utility can never equal objective.
Well, it is, since math so beautifully or so correctly, I suppose, maps to reality, we are affirming it, right?
No. So math does not objectively exist. Math objectively describes reality. Like if I say the sky is blue, that sentence objectively describes reality. If I said the sky is green, that sentence would not describe reality. But the sentence itself, neither sentence exists. They're not real things other than independent of our imagination. They're just sentences we've made up. So you could never say the sky is blue has utility because it describes reality. Therefore, the sentence the sky is blue exists. Clearly not. The thing which describing exists, and the sentence correspondence to reality is true, but the sentence doesn't exist just because it has utility. Same would be oughts. Oughts don't exist because they have utility. It would just mean that they do something in the world.
Well, yeah, we are mapping to the state of our language, the state of our behavior.
Yes, but that doesn't mean it objectively exists.
Well, that doesn't mean that they objectively exist. Do you think that sociological principles objectively exist?
No.
No.
Exist means true. Objectively, existence means it's true, independent of any mind.
Yeah.
So,
and behaviors exist because of minds? Yeah.
Well, no. Behaviors exist. Sociological principles are things we use to describe behaviors.
Sociological principles. Yeah, but when we speak of sociology, we speak of tendencies, right? So it is it is in the tendency of mind object of sentient existences, I suppose, conscious existences, to behave XYZ, right?
Sure, yes.
In a similar vein, we can say that it is a tendency of our language that we use oughts in a XYZ way.
Sure.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, it's objectively true that we use oughts. So we use oughts is an objectively true statement, just like we feed people is an objectively true statement. So descriptions of our nature and culture are objectively true for sure.
So if we can make a standard which correctly makes those behaviors known, right? We can understand them through that system, and we can make future inferences from that system. Would you say that that ought system would be objective?
No, the oughts would still not be objective. So it's like that would be saying, I can create a sociological principle that accurately describes human morality. I can accurately describe how human morality will work in the future. Therefore, we ought to do human morality does not follow. So again, it's the is-ought problem. You can't get from the ises of accurately describing everything about humans do. Say you could get a perfect principle that describes everything about human morality, and today and in the future. Does that mean you ought to do anything? No, the ought can't follow there. So you can't make the ought objective, even if you have a principle that accurately describes everything humans are doing.
You cannot make it descriptive. That's true.
Prescriptive. You can't make it prescriptive because that's the problem.
Well, aren't oughts prescriptive? Like they.
Yes.
Let me Google this.
That's the problem.
Yeah, I cannot make prescriptions descriptions. That's what I tried to say.
Right. To make oughts objective, you would need to make them not prescriptions. Prescriptions, there's no way for a prescription to be objective.
It cannot be the case that a prescription is objective.
Pretty much. That's a good way to phrase it.
Why would you say that?
Because prescriptions, as far as I know, are things that are like commands. They come from a mind, as far as I can tell.
Sure, but if we can, like, if it is reasonable to affirm, let's say the grounding, like this is what I'm trying to kind of conceptualize to myself. Like if we can affirm the first prescription, the prescription which would, let's say, metaphysically ground all previous prescriptions, or metaphysically determined from Realism, I don't know, metaphysically determine or explain previous or subsequent oughts, that would make it objective, because it is basic prescriptions on a linear chain of prescriptions, which by very design cannot be dependent on a mind, right?
No. How can a prescription exist without being dependent on a mind?
Well, the state of how you operate, like the idea of a prescription, would be mind dependent. That's true. But how that prescription actually is wouldn't be, because we have formulated it in this sort of linear mathematical way, like a line. When I think of line, every line in my head is necessarily subjective to my thinking, but the line itself, the thing that I'm thinking of, isn't.
So how can the prescription exist independent of a mind?
Like if we can make a system such so that it is reasonable to affirm it.
Affirmations mean nothing. That you can't affirm something, therefore it's subjective. So how can you make a prescription objective?
Well, you're not affirming. You're affirming the first prescription. Like it is reasonable for us to operate in a system which
it doesn't matter. That literally doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter how we operate. Our operations are completely irrelevant.
I'm not sure how that critique follows. Let me think a bit.
So things are objective. Like it doesn't matter. We could be reasonable to like act in such a way that is not in correspondence to reality if it's beneficial. Well, that doesn't mean we should then accept whatever it is we're acting as being true about reality. It makes no difference. Like, for example, we can say belief in a God. Let's say we could prove for a fact God does not exist at all, completely imaginary. But it's very beneficial to society for people to believe in a God. Based on your argument, it seems like you're saying, therefore, we could then conclude it's reasonable to say that it's objective that God exists just because it's beneficial to society. The fact that it's beneficial to society does not mean it's objective or reasonable to conclude it's objective about reality.
Yeah, but it's not about. Let me kind of make a tangent here, because I think that I am losing myself in a bit, and this might clear a bit something up. For example, countability of sets is determined by what is a natural number. Natural number is determined by what Peano axioms are. Peano axioms are axioms, the system axioms of arithmetic, right? Algebra, a lot of things, right? They determine how we think of natural numbers. Would you say that is that formulation, that sequence, how we get from natural numbers to from Peano axioms to natural numbers to some theorem, countability, is objective?
No, it's all subjective methodology.
Okay. Would you say that how we, like, for example, I see this computer, right? I interpret, my eyes interpret the computer, right?
Yes.
And everything that I am seeing from the computer to my eye lenses to my brain, I interpret methodologically because I'm stating that I trust my senses are sufficiently valid. What my senses purport gives me the sufficient reason, or whatever, sufficient reason to affirm that the computer is real. Would you say that computer existing is objective?
The computer existing is objective, yes, but that's true independent of anything that you experience. Your epistemological means is irrelevant to its ontology.
Okay, the subsequent question here is, does my reasoning, which flowed, right, the flow of my reasoning, how I know that computer is actually there, is that objective?
I don't know, like what method are you using? Like, no, the method can't be objective, no.
Okay. So how do you know that how do you come to the conclusion that the computer which is in front of me is actually there? How do you know that it exists? How do you affirm its ontology?
Because I have a method that differentiates imagination from reality. So I say novel testable predictions is an imaginary method. It doesn't exist objectively, but that method can tell us about things that do exist objectively. So I have an imaginary principle, science, and science can tell us which things exist objectively. But the scientific method isn't objective. Science is not objective. Science is a method we made up, but it can tell us about objective things.
Okay, sure. So if I were to go into, so I see one computer here, and that one computer makes me think that one exists, and I say one exists objectively. How would you say that I'm wrong or correct? Would you say I'm wrong or?
I don't know what you mean. So if you have some methodology like science, and you use science to determine that a computer is objective, that's fine. That science wouldn't be objective. At no point would science be objective.
I'm following your reasoning here, but at this point, I'm seeing one computer.
Yes.
I'm seeing specifically one computer, and I'm stating that ontologically one exists, right?
Yeah.
It exists independently of me. Would you say that that is true or false?
Sure.
Okay. Let me now go back to morality a bit. So when I look at behavior of human beings, and I see that they use their language, their behavior, as if they have a universal principle, and I say, well, this universal principle, whatever it is, I have not actually concluded what it is. I just know that this universal principle, that is all I know, exists. How would you respond to that?
You haven't used any methodology to determine the universal principle exists. You just said people do it.
I haven't given the principle. No. I haven't given principle. No, I just said that they have some principle. They have a universal
That's
principle.
not evidence. So again, you need a method to differentiate imagination from reality. Science works. Science, you can show the computer is there. So scientifically show the computer is there. You now have reason to believe, because of science, that it exists mind independently. The fact that people use it doesn't matter. The fact that people see it doesn't matter. So you need some equivalent way to science to show that the moral oughtness is real.
Okay, so I see from my knowledge of, let's say, sociology, or my knowledge of linguistics, or I don't know, common sense, I suppose, that people use ought, and I can validate this experience through science.
The fact that people use oughts is irrelevant. All you've done is shown that people use oughts. That doesn't mean the oughts are objective.
Oh, of course, this is not the point of it. So people, and they use it universalizably. So when they speak, they're not speaking about what they think. They're speaking about universal states of existence. So they're stating everyone ought not do this, or this certain group ought not do this. So it's a universal principle. And I can say that I know through science, let's say, that this is actually happening. Is this okay thus far?
Yeah, people use oughts. It's objectively the case that people use oughts.
It's objectively the crucial part is that they objectively use oughts as if oughts are objective.
That's the same. So they objectively use oughts. Like they objectively think God exists. People think God exists. Yes.
Yeah, but sure. And if I can make a model, or let's say a model of which would be the prescriptive model rather than a descriptive, something like you have science. Science is the descriptive model which maps descriptive statements, let's say. And if I can make a prescriptive model such as X, Y, Z, which maps to prescriptive problems, how would that be? How would that be any worse than science?
Well, again, so you saying people use this thing, it's objectively the fact that people imagine oughts, does not mean it is objectively the case that oughts exist.
But it would be the similar thing, right? I have a maybe I can give you like a comparison quickly. People we see, so people see that computers exist, therefore through method of science we know that computers exist. People
No,
see
no. You could never say people see, therefore it's subjective. No.
Okay, so how is maybe I can write this down for me. Maybe I'm just not understanding correctly. Blocks a piece. So how do I know that the computer is objectively there? Or
science, novel testable predictions, interactions with the world. Science does that. It's not just people see it. So
Science.
it's not just that people use it. It's not just that people see it. There's a complete scientific methodology that can differentiate those two.
Differentiates what is real from what is fictional or imagined. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to kind of repeat. I'm sorry, I'm not very fast with these kinds of topics. They're not natural to me. So I can definitively say that I can scientifically conclude that people use oughts as if they are universal.
Yes.
Okay. Can I make a method, whatever method, let's say method XYZ, which would make it so that oughts are now objective?
Yes.
Okay. This is what I was trying to do with my ought chain, and maybe, do you have any maybe idea how that method could work?
Yeah, it's science, novel testable prediction. You just say, if morality is an objective thing in the world, here's some test we could do that could demonstrate it's a real thing in the world.
So science needs to be the method which determines prescriptions.
Well, no, like you need any way that can differentiate imagination from reality reliably, but the only one I know about is science. So if if you came up with a different methodology that was equivalent to science, that would work too, but you would need to show that the oughts are existing independently of our imagination, and we can't make them objective. We can't like make oughts into existence objective, but if they were already objective, we could discover it through science.
They're already objective. We can discover it through science. Do you think that we find objective truths through math as well?
Yes.
How about logic?
Yes.
So the only thing, not the only thing, it's a thing which I have to find is a methodology which you would feel satisfied with, which would describe reality, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you say that the reality is such that we use universal oughts, right?
Yeah, it's objectively that we use oughts as if they were universal, which does nothing.
Okay. So we have a state of reality which is indicative of the state of universalized oughts. So I need to find a method which depicts universalized oughts, right?
Not depicts, discovers, but yeah.
Okay. So this is going to be very vague because it is intended as such. It's my thinking in the infancy. If we can, the first part of the methodology is just to find the function which operates on morality, and that function is already given by moral propositions. And in your case, it would be what was it? The ultimate, the perfect world in which everyone's will is maximized. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so that's my description of the moral principle.
Yes. So that's would it be also fair to say that the function which would make us get to that world would be the function which sequentially goes from this world and gradually progresses from states of our world to the best possible world.
Sure, that would be the state that got us there. That would.
Yes. Okay. So we already know the first part of the method. The first part of the method is the function which makes.
No. You haven't given any part of the method yet. So we have a principle that we think is right, and we have a know that if it's right, we can assume that this is what the world would look like once we get there, and we can make a principle of how to get there. None of that demonstrates it's actually objective. None of that is relevant. This is all empty.
This is all just a speculation at this point. That's true, and I don't know if your theory is correct. It's just at this point, it's just my intellectual thinking, I suppose, which gives me indications one way or the other. So if we can make a theory which would test it, let's say scientifically through like p-values or sigma values, or maybe a lesser degree gradient of probability like p1 or p2, which could adequately capture the meaning of moral proclamations, of ought proclamations, like everyone ought to do X, this group ought to do X, right? In their thinking, not in their actual proclamations. Would you say that would be a good moral methodology, or methodology in general?
If you could capture the meaning, like if you could know what they mean and discover it corresponds to something in reality, but just knowing what it means is irrelevant. Capturing the meaning is irrelevant. It would be, you'd have to show what it means actually corresponds to something. That corresponds to something in reality is the part we need.
Yeah, corresponds to how they speak, what they mean when they speak, and their behavior.
Nothing about the people has to be completely independent of all people. No people exist at all, ever, no matter what. Now show it corresponds to something.
It cannot exist with people.
Yeah,
so you would say
correspond to objectively means no people there, still corresponds to something.
Okay, so no people. I don't think. How about? This is why I said about sociology. Sociology, I think you would say that it's objective, right?
It's an objective fact in the universe. Sociology doesn't objectively exist in the universe. It's just a fact that exists. Like Harry Potter. Harry Potter is an objectively existing thing. Does it exist without people? No, it was never there unless J.K. Rowling invented it. So it's not objectively existing independent of people.
So sociology is subjective. Would that be fair to say?
It describes actions of a specific subset of the universe. So yes, it's a subjectively things about subjective content.
Okay, so it describes behavior or subjective things, and would it be subjective itself?
Yes, I mean it's a methodology, so it is a subjective methodology.
Oh. You would say that everything which is in any way, shape, or form connected to mind things is. How would you then say that your moral positions are?
It's a law of physics. I think morality is literally an existing field in physics, like gravity. So it exists even if there were no minds ever.
Well, how can will be maximized if there is no will?
That's like gravity. Gravity is there even if no particles are there to affect it. The space-time field exists even if there's no particles to affect it. So the field of morality is there even if there are no wills.
What would be in that field? Like what is being maximized?
No. So the field is a field. It is a physical field. Even if it affects nothing, the field is still there.
So there is a field of morality?
Yes. Literally like gravity, like a moral field.
Okay. And what describes that field?
What describes? I don't know what you mean. Like words describe it?
Gravity is described in particle physics by gravitons.
Yeah. So I think the principle that describes the field is that it is pushing us towards a world where any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. So I think that principle describes the actions of the field.
Mm-hmm. And if there is no will, there is no maximization, but the principle is still there.
Yeah, the principle is still there. So like you could say objects with mass attract, that describes gravity. If there's no objects, gravity is still there. The field is still there. The space-time field is still there. We just don't know about it.
Well, it's hard for me to think like. So if in let's say in particle physics, if graviton theory is completely correct, then if gravitons don't exist, neither does gravity.
Yes, but that means gravitons can exist, but there are no other mass particles. So no particles with mass exist, gravitons exist, gravity, space-time still exist.
Yeah, but the field would necessarily hold that which is dependent on it.
No.
It would hold.
It could be empty. Like the graviton field can just be there with no particles, no mass particles at all, just photons.
Except gravitons. Yeah. So if gravitons are that which is used in determination of gravity, then if our principle is maximization of will, if there is no will, how is there a field?
Again, I've already answered this like 10 times. It does not matter. If there is zero things with mass that exist, there's no mass anywhere, nothing is mass, gravity still exists. The fact that it affects something means nothing. It can still exist, even if it affects nothing. So morality can be there if there are no minds. It's just affecting nothing. There can be fields which exist and do nothing. We just wouldn't know about them. So there's no problem with gravity existing and nothing for it to affect.
Oh, sure. Maybe I can be more clear, I suppose. But if this doesn't, if I'm just repeating myself after this, I will let someone else speak. Okay. What I'm thinking about is that the gravity is dependent on gravitons. It is not that they are interacting with gravitons. Gravitons make gravity. So if there is no gravitons, there is no gravity.
Right. So in morality, if there is no moral field, there is no morality. But if the moral field can exist, even if there are no wills there, wills don't make the moral field.
Okay. If my memory serves, the moral field is depicted by the will.
That's the principle. Like E equals mc squared describes, or I don't know the longer g thingy, g over g whatever for gravity, but it's represented by an equation. The equation doesn't exist. Nowhere does the equation exist. The equation represents the existing field. The field exists. The principle, involuntary imposition of will is immoral, is just like the equation. It is just the mathematical equation to describe the field. The field exists. The principle just describes the field just like math does. That's it.
I really don't understand. I'm sorry.
This shouldn't be hard. So we wrote down letters like E equals mc squared. That's a bunch of letters we wrote down. E equals mc squared doesn't exist anywhere. It's a bunch of letters we wrote down on a piece of paper that represent an existing relationship. The stuff exists. The field exists. The equation does not exist. Nowhere, anywhere in the universe can you find E equals mc squared. It is something humans made up to describe the field. So the sentence, involuntary imposition of will is immoral, is a sentence, just like E equals mc squared. It's just a sentence to describe how the field interacts with things. It's like mass, things with mass attract. It's a description of how the field interacts. The description doesn't need to exist. The description is just a description. It's something humans made up. The field still exists. Even if nothing was there to affect it, the field would still be there. Right? The gravity's there even if there are no other particles.
Yeah, that's true.
So even if there are no wills, the moral field is there. It's literally just a field made of other kinds of like quantum field particles.
Okay. It's really not clicking for me because I'm learning now about J. Wilson's on grounding. It's a critique of metaphysics of grounding. And usually, like, we have these causation chains, right? Some X causes Y causes Z, right? And if X is not there, it is just linear progression.
Oh my God, no. Morality is the graviton. So there is a graviton for morality. It exists. It's not will. Will is not the graviton. Will is what affects the graviton or is affected by the graviton. So will is like a proton. If there are no protons anywhere in the universe, gravitons still exist. Gravitons are still there. They're still fine. They don't affect any protons because there are no protons. The graviton field still there. So morality is like the graviton. It's there. There is a field. There is a moral field. Even if there are no wills, wills are like a proton. Doesn't matter if they're there. The field is still there.
Yeah. field being there, and I do understand the mathematics of it being there. The confusion is that it seems to me that you have defined the field as operating, like the function of the field is that it maximizes will. If there is
the outcome, that's the outcome. That's what it will do. If it could maximize itself, if there were wills, they would be maximized.
Yeah, like if there is inputs, the function would maximize it, and the output would be the maximization.
Yes.
The most optimal solution of the function.
Yes.
And the function is predicated on the inputs. If the function operates at all, it needs to have inputs.
No,
because
no. Again, gravity is there even if there are no inputs, no protons, no neutrons, nothing with mass, still there. We just wouldn't know it. We would never know it. We'd never be able to discover the equations of gravity. They'd be there. We just never know them. So if there's nothing there to affect it, it still exists. The field is still there. We would just never know about it.
Field is still there. We would just never know about it. We'll never know about it. Field is still there. Sorry, I'm just thinking. It's just not clicking for some reason.
Oh my God, this is not even hard. If we never knew any math, we never discovered any physics, it would still be there. If no particles ever existed, gravity would still be there. If the universe, there's no Big Bang, gravity is still there. If there's nothing for it to interact with, it's still there.
Yeah, that would be epistemology, but we could have known it because it is there.
Ontology is irrelevant to epistemology here. So I'm saying morality is there even if we never know it. So no Big Bang, morality is there with gravity, beginning of the universe. We never know anything because we don't exist, still there.
Well, if there isn't, if it exists independent of anything interacting with thing existing, then the opposite of it exists independent of it.
No, it can exist independent of interactions just fine. It doesn't need to interact with anything. It just exists just fine. Nothing else. It could just exist on its own with literally nothing else.
Sure, I suppose. I will, because I'm not getting this, and there are so many people here. Maybe someone wants to speak, and I will just say that I don't get it. I will see the point, I suppose, out of intellectual honesty, but I don't get it. Sorry.
What is the part that you don't get?
I explained it so many times that maybe a time will let me digest it better. Maybe that's it.
Okay, imagine there's a universe, right? And it has one less object than this universe. Then imagine a universe that has two less objects, a universe that has three less, and keep going until you get just one object, and that is the universe. It exists independently of anything else. Why would that be a problem?
Well, it depends. I don't know what the universe depends on. That's some odd metaphysics, right? Is universe with nothing in it a universe? Wouldn't that be nothing?
We're not talking about universes with nothing in it. We're talking about a universe that consists of just one thing.
Well, that one thing is what existence is, or
right.
Universe, or however you want to call it.
And it doesn't need to interact with anything else, because there is no anything else.
Yeah, because definitionally, what existence is there's all that exists.
Now add something else, and it still doesn't interact with that second thing, but it's still there.
It could, right? Yeah, and those two things would now be existence.
Yeah, and one of them, the original one, might not interact with the second thing at all, but it would still be there.
But this is a function. Functions exist operationally. I don't know, maybe.
Functions just describe the interaction. So even if there was no interaction, it would still be there. We just didn't know the interaction. So gravity, imagine in this universe, that's a good example. Thank you, whoever is talking. In this universe, there's gravity and there's something else which doesn't affect gravity. Neutrinos, photons, whatever, that don't have a mass, don't affect gravity. Sure. If there was something there, if a photon or if a proton came into existence, we could measure the photon's interaction with the graviton field and we could come up with all the equations of gravity. Mm-hmm. But if it doesn't, the graviton field still exists. So it doesn't matter if there's a photon. It doesn't matter if we can measure the interactions. None of the interactions matter, because what matters is does the graviton field exist? Yes. Is the graviton field objective? Yes. So if the moral field is there, even if nothing is there to interact with it, it's still objective. It still exists. even if we don't know about the principles.
I think I understand now. How about if I say behaviors exist even if there is nothing to behave? How would you respond to that?
I think that would be like they were platonic, so I don't think it's possible. I think behaviors are just a language we use to describe. I don't think behaviors exist, but they're just a word we use to describe stuff.
It's for example, when I move my arm, that's movement, right? How about there exists a state of movement without anything moving?
No, I don't think that would work. I think that's a contradiction.
Okay. Yeah, this is what my mind is going to. Maybe this is me just going completely apeshit. Right?
So like an analogy would be
this is a function operating on nothing. This is just a behavior not moving.
So you could say that movement is some kind of, like say movement was caused by some field. There is a field that causes all movement, and that field is objective. So even if no movement exists, the field that causes movement exists, right?
Okay. And that field this is what sociology studies, right? The field of movement.
No, there's no field of movement.
The actual field of movement.
There's no field of movement in sociology. No sociologists say that there's actually some field that causes human interaction. It's purely just evolution.
Sure.
So that would be the difference here. The difference is that in mine, I'm saying there is literally a field of morality. Sociology say there's no field. We're just studying the way humans act. So there's nothing causing that.
There is. Would it be fair to say that there is a field of actual behavior which society studies?
Field of what?
What actually transpires in our existence or our state of universe.
I don't know what that means. Like physics?
Behaviors, like apes have a tendency to scratch their whatever, right? Eat bananas or things like that.
Yeah, but there's no objective field causing that. That's just subjective interactions.
How about the objective field of proximate want, right?
There's no such field.
To scratch. There is no such field of wants?
No.
There are no wants?
Wants aren't a field. Like literally you're saying, is there a graviton of wants? No.
Maybe field is a bad word because fields in mathematics are different. A set of things, right? It procures a set of
okay, sets don't matter. Fields do. So in my case, I'm saying morality is like the graviton. It literally exists like a field. And no way in sociology does that anything exist in sociology as a fundamental field of the universe.
Okay, what do you mean by field?
Like the thing in physics that is the fundamental nature of reality? I don't know.
Because I'm thinking about fields in mathematics, so this is...
I'm talking about physics. So I'm saying literally graviton field, electromagnetic field, Hilbert space field, quantum fields, literally existing fields, the things that really literally exist.
A number of another tensors that has value for each point in space-time. Well, if space-time, okay, no need, whatever.
There are fields outside of space-time too, so that's not.
Well, that has value for each point in space-time.
No. That's the wrong definition of field. So in physics, there are fields, quantum fields that created space-time. Space-time is emergent from other fundamental fields, so that's not the right definition.
Okay, so not Wikipedia then. Could you give me a link to this definition, maybe?
No. I don't really want to take the time to look up right at all. Like this shouldn't be something that's like super important to debate. In physics, there's something that's the most fundamental thing in all the universe. We're going to call that a field. It's literally an existing physical object.
What is a field in physics? A field is an imaginary, you can say, a mathematical concept, partially we have no better explanation. Or there been something like. I'm going to read about fields a bit and I'll come back.
Okay.
Tom. Hello.
Hey.
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I was going to ask on the subject of fields. Do you think, like in the future, we'll be able to develop science in a way that would, like, understand fields on a more, like, fundamental level?
Yes.
And do you think, like, in the same way where we thought like atoms were the most smallest thing, and obviously we know better. We know that we can look at it at a more closer scale. Do you think that fields would be in the same way, that we might find like a more fundamental thing than the field?
Maybe. I don't know.
I think, yeah, because I wondered if it's like if it's going to be a case of where there'd be an explanation for the field rather than just the field being the most fundamental thing.
It is definitely possible. I tend to lean towards that fields are fundamental, but it's definitely possible that there's something else.
Now, just another quick question, slightly on that topic. In terms of like infinite regression, I think you said before that this is an idea that's accepted. Is that just in philosophy or also in physics?
You mean a past infinite regression of stuff?
Yeah, like cause and effect.
Yeah, that's the consensus in physics. No, I don't know about philosophy. It is in physics.
Okay, so if I wanted to learn more about that, where would I go to understand more about like infinite regression of causes and effect?
You probably have to go to, like in physics, they don't talk about it much. They just say that, yeah, there's just a past infinite of like stuff, just like there is of space, because space and time are infinite. But you just go into the theories like string theory, multiverse theory, many worlds theory. What they posit is that there's usually an infinite regress of particles, virtual particle stuff. But like if you want to ask why do they think there is such a thing, you'd probably have to go with like the debates between Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig where they actually talk about that, because it's not something physicists have a problem with.
Is there an actual argument for an infinite regression?
I think so. Like there's no logical contradiction. Like there's no reason to not have that. There's no reason to think there is an absolute beginning, or even if there was, there'd have to be something else there. So there always had to have always been something, no matter what, even in the God hypothesis.
Yes.
So it's more of a axiomatic thing, sort of assumed.
No, it's more like the theistic argument against an infinite regress is simply a semantic game. Like there's always an infinite regress. Even if there's God, there is something. God was something that's always existed. So there's no coherent way to think of a universe where there was at some point literally nothing.
Okay,
Well,
and you would say that there's no explanation for that thing. It's just necessary by definition. Is that what we would say?
Well, no, that's something that's just made up in philosophy. There's no such thing in physics. There's no evidence of any such property in physics. All of the things in physics, like in order to make a physical theory, you have to use other principles and particles in physics. And so necessary being isn't one. There's no basis for such a term in physics anywhere. You can't use that in physics. That's why it's not used in physics.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that.
Yep. Anybody else got anything? Questions, comments, whatever?
Yeah, Tom. The only other thing I'd say is that, like, in terms of like the same way that you don't admire individuals, you admire arguments. I'm the same. I think out of a lot of popular atheists, I think your argument of differentiating imagination from reality is probably one of the strongest ways of being able to debate with a theist. They don't ever debate the premises because they accept it, and then obviously they have a burden of proof. So
yep,
I thank you for presenting that argument, because I appreciate and I use that argument quite frequently. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a great compliment. Very, very honored. Anybody else? Questions, comments, arguments, stuff? All right, I think I'll shut it down for today. See you guys later. Thanks for joining the stream. Talk to you guys. I think I have one tomorrow. Yes, I have one tomorrow at 4 p.m. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace out. See you later.